No one came to the Duke of Halstock's birthday, and Keziah Velikot knew it before the clock told her, because the house told her first. The kitchen fires were banked low instead of built high. The good plate stayed in its bays. Racombe Abbey smelled of beeswax and cold stone and faintly of bread going hard in the larder that nobody had thought to carry up because nobody had come to eat it. She was not important enough to be told anything directly. She learned it the way she learned most things, by standing near enough with a basket on her hip and letting the housekeeper's worry spill over her like water over a low wall. Mrs. Pardo said it plain, twice, the way people do when saying a thing twice might change it. Not one carriage, not one card, and then quieter the part Keziah had not known. It was the same week he was thrown. 3 years, near enough to the day. Keziah was nobody in that house and had made her peace with it. She was the still-room maid who came before dawn and left the cordials stopped and the preserves counted. She had a boy of 2 asleep in a draw bed by the scullery fire because she had nowhere safer to put him. She had a husband not quite 2 years dead, and a name she still wore like a coat cut for a bigger winter than her own. Downstairs there was a cake with 1 candle in it, made by a kitchen girl who had cried making it. Upstairs there was a man at a cold window who had asked nobody to celebrate anything, because he had learned, the same way Keziah had learned, not to ask for what would not come. Subscribe to the channel and stay with her, because what happened in that house before the candle burned out was on nobody's calendar, and it began with a boy who was too quick on his feet. It had rained since noon, coming down off the Blackdown Hills in a steady gray sheet that got into linen no matter how close it hung to a fire, the sort of rain that made the whole parish talk of nothing but the state of the roads and the price of a loaf, which had not come down since spring and showed no sign of doing so before Christmas. It was the 3rd autumn since the corn had failed across half the kingdom, and worse than failed in Ireland. And though Racombe itself was not a poor parish, poor enough men lived within a morning's walk of it that the price of wheat was spoken of in the servants' hall the way other households spoke of the weather, which was to say constantly, and always as though it might yet turn for the better if enough people wished for it hard enough. Racombe Abbey stood gray and long against a grayer sky, 3 miles from the nearest turnpike, and further still from anywhere a caller with a warm carriage might trouble to come without a reason worth the mud. It had been built by men who meant it to be seen from a distance and admired from a distance. Keziah had come, in 2 years of service, to think there was something in the house itself that had settled into its master's habit of being admired that way and touched by no one at all. Tabitha Escott, who was 14 and had never before been asked to bake anything grander than bread, had spent the better part of the afternoon on a small cake nobody had ordered. Using butter she had no real business spending out of the still-room stores, and had cried over the mixing bowl the whole while without once explaining why. And nobody in the kitchen had pressed her for a reason, because everybody in that kitchen already knew it. It was the 3rd year running that no carriage had come up that drive on the 28th of October, and a household learns its own griefs the way a body learns weather in an old wound without needing to be told twice what the ache means. Keziah kept her own grief in a different room of herself and visited it rarely. Reuben had been dead not quite 2 years, taken by the same putrid fever that had very nearly taken their son in the same fortnight, and she had learned in the months since to carry his memory the way she carried the name Velikot, worn every day and mentioned almost never. She did not think of herself as a woman still in mourning. She thought of herself as a woman with a great deal of work and a boy to raise on it, and grief, she had found, was patient enough to wait for the rare quarter hour she had spare to give it. She was 27 that autumn, with her mother's dark coloring and her mother's steady hands, and a face the housekeeper had once told her, not unkindly, gave away a good deal less than most. She had married Reuben Vellacott at 19, against her own mother's mild but unmistakable reservations, because he had a steady clerk's hand and a way of listening to her that made her feel, for the first time in her life, like a person whose opinions were worth the trouble of forming properly. 4 years of marriage had taught her that a good listener was not always the same thing as an open book, that a man could sit across a kitchen table from a woman every evening for years and still keep some private room of himself locked, out of pride or shame or simple habit, that she never once got the key to while he lived. She had not resented him for it, not then, believing as she had that every marriage kept some small locked room or other, and it was only now, a widow, finding papers sewn into linings, that she had begun to understand how much a man might carry alone rather than trouble a wife he loved with the weight of it. Keziah did not yet know what the evening held. She only knew the drive stayed empty as a held breath long past the hour when a caller might reasonably still arrive, that the tenants down toward Chard owed more in unpaid rent than any of them liked to say aloud this year. With the price of a loaf what it was, and the harvest what it had been, and that somewhere above her a duke sat in a window that looked down a road nobody was using. The way a person watches a door they already know will not open and cannot quite stop themselves from watching anyway. He had told the household there was to be no fuss made of the day, and Mrs. Pardo had passed the instruction down to the kitchen with her mouth set thin, the way she delivered any order she privately thought foolish, but had no standing to refuse. Nobody had tested whether he meant it. Nobody, that particular evening, would get the chance, because it was while Keziah was carrying a fresh scuttle of coal up toward the long gallery, meaning to leave it outside the library door, as she always did before the fire was made up for the night, that she first heard, through the crack beneath the door, the low, even sound of a man's voice reading something aloud to nobody at all, and understood that he was still awake and still working on the one evening of the year when most men in his position would have allowed themselves simply to sit. She knocked because it was proper and was told to come in. The library at that hour held only the one lamp on the desk, and a fire that had burned down further than it ought to have been let, the shelves rising into a dark she could not see the top of. And Gervase Aylward sat where she had grown used to finding him, in the long window that overlooked the drive, in a wheeled chair his physician had ordered against his wishes, and that he had used every day since, because he had learned, he told her once, in an offhand way that first winter, that hating a thing and needing it were not, whatever a man might prefer to believe, mutually exclusive. He was 34 that day, dark-haired and gray-eyed, and still built like the writer he had once been, though the 2 years of stillness had thinned him through the shoulders. In a way his coats were cut to hide from anyone who did not already know to look. What the household said of him, in the careless way households say things about the family they serve, was that he had been thrown from a young stallion on the charred road, and had not felt his legs since, and had grown grave in the years since the accident in a manner some called dignity and others called something closer to a slow closing of a door. Keziah had heard both descriptions offered in the same breath by the same housemaid on more than one occasion, and had come, privately, to distrust both of them equally, having found, in her own 2 years of carrying his coal and his correspondence, that a man rarely fit as neatly into either word as the servants' hall liked to believe. A great sheaf of papers lay across his knee, closely written in his own hand, an ink bottle wedged into the arm of the chair where it could not easily tip. She had not meant to look at what he was writing. It was not her place, and she knew it well enough. But the topmost sheet lay half-turned toward the door, and her eye went to it the way any eye goes to a page left open. Because 4 years of copying legal papers by candlelight at her own kitchen table, back when her husband still had work to bring home to her, had left her with a habit that did not leave a person simply because the reason for it had. The page concerned the well beneath the church at Racombe Magna. Columns of figures ran down one side, dates set against them. And against certain of those dates, a second column that turned her stomach cold before her mind had proper library finished naming what it was looking at. Infant deaths, entered month by month. 3 years back, set beside the months, the well ran low, and the parish was forced instead onto the shallow spring behind the mill. He noticed her reading it before she thought to look away. "You know that well," he said. "It was not quite a question. I grew up not 4 miles from it, Your Grace," she said. "My mother kept account of every well between here and Chard, and which ones turned bad in a dry summer, and that one was always the worst of them." "And did it turn this past August?" he asked. "It did," she said. "There is a taste of copper in it after a long dry spell, and any house that draws from it that month has a child sick with its stomach inside the week. My mother always held it was the old lead pipe under the churchyard wall, though she never lived to prove it to anyone with the standing to care. She kept a garden of her own remedies most of her life, Your Grace, and buried more children she could not save than she ever liked to speak of. And she used to say a well told the truth about a parish faster than any vicar would." "And what would mend it?" he asked. "Not the parish's opinion of the vicar. The well itself. A new pipe," she said. "Copper or good glazed earthenware lay deep enough to clear the old lead entirely. It is not a difficult thing to do, Your Grace. It only wants someone willing to pay for it before the wanting becomes a burying instead." He looked at her a moment in a way that made her wonder if she had spoken further than her place allowed, and then he picked up his pen and wrote what she had told him, as near as she could tell word for word, and did not look up again for a long moment. Kezia understood, with a small warmth she did not examine too closely, that he had set down among figures a magistrate or a physician might one day be made to read. It occurred to her, watching him write, that she had never once heard him spoken of in the servants' hall as a fool, whatever else was said of him, and that a man who kept such careful account of infant deaths in a parish that was not strictly his own duty to mind was not a man whose mind wanted for its ordinary sense, however little the rest of him answered him these days. On the tray at his elbow, where she set the coal scuttle before withdrawing, a letter lay open in a hand she did not yet know, though she would come to know it a good deal better before the winter was out. She was not trying to read it any more than she had tried to read the report, but one line sat near the top in a script large enough to catch a passing eye, and it caught hers twice over, because its writer had troubled to say the same thing twice within the space of one short paragraph. That a man in his condition ought not to overtax himself with visitors this year. That a man in his condition was surely wiser, on the whole, to let his birthday pass quietly, as he had let the two before it pass. The letter was signed with a hand that ended in a flourish Keziah did not recognize and would learn, before too many weeks had passed, to recognize at a glance across a room. Keziah withdrew without being asked to, and thought no more of the letter that evening, not yet knowing how often its writer's name would come to sit in her thoughts before the year was out. She went back down to the still room and was halfway through counting a shelf of preserve jars a second time, more from habit than any real doubt of the first count, when she noticed the house around her had gone unusually quiet. Quiet in the particular way that meant something in it had come loose from its ordinary place. She went up to the scullery to look in on Amos and found the drawbed empty, the blanket thrown back, the small shape that ought to have filled it simply gone. She did not let herself panic. She had learned, over 2 years of a boy quicker on his feet than any bolt she had ever managed to fix to a low door, that panic wasted seconds a proper search could not spare. She checked the passage first, then the kitchen stairs, then stood a moment with her heart going and made herself listen instead of run, and it was listening that found him before searching would have. She followed the only sound moving through the silent house, a small voice singing very badly and with a great deal of confidence, somewhere above her. She found him in the library, on the Duke's lap. She stood in the doorway with her hands still on the frame, and for a moment, considerably longer than a moment, did not breathe at all. Amos was perched on his knee, holding a wooden button he had produced from some pocket of his own, one of a small hoard he kept in an old tobacco tin salvaged from a box of mending, things Keziah had never had the heart to sort through properly, and which he treated as treasure precisely because his mother handled it so seldom, and Gervase Aylward, whom the upper housemaids called grave behind his back, and worse things when nobody was listening, was turning the button over between 2 fingers as though it were the single object of value in the room. He was not smiling. He was watching the boy's face the way a person watches something whose shape they had all but forgotten. Amos was singing the tune Keziah sang him to sleep, every word of it wrong and every note worse, entirely unbothered by either fact, his small stockinged feet swinging well clear of the floor. "Your Grace," Keziah said, "I beg your pardon. Let me take him from you." "Leave him," Gervase said. She did not move. "He does not know enough to be afraid of me," he said. And something in the way he said it told her that this, to him, explained a great deal more than the words themselves. There was no self-pity in it, only a kind of plain accounting, the way he had accounted for the well. She had 100 sound reasons to cross the floor and lift her son away, and she used not one of them, because the Duke's face in that low light looked like a man who had not been touched, in longer than he could easily have said, by anyone who wanted nothing from him for it, and her son's careless weight on his knee was the first thing that whole evening to have asked absolutely nothing of him at all. She stayed. She found the stub of candle she carried in her apron for the back stairs, lit it from the grate, and set it, without any ceremony, on the corner of his desk, beside the columns of figures and the letter with its careful repetition, because there was no cake in that room, and she was not about to fetch the small sad one up from the larder and turn its sadness into a spectacle for anyone, least of all for a man who had spent the whole evening pretending he did not want one. "It is little enough as birthday candles go," she said. "It is the only one anyone has troubled to light for me this year," he said. She did not curtsy. She did not apologize a second time. She sat down on the low stool beside the cold hearth because her legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold her up, and she watched her son turn a wooden button over and over in a Duke's 2 hands. And for a while none of them said anything else at all, and the rain kept on against the long window, and the candle burned a little lower, and the fire gave one small collapsing shift in the grate that none of the 3 of them troubled to mend. It was, though she would not have called it that at the time, the first wholly peaceful quarter hour she had spent in that house since she had come to it. She carried Amos back to the drawbed a little later, her heart going harder than the errand alone required, and told herself it was only the fear of dismissal that made it beat so. She was nearly persuaded of that by the time she reached the passage where Mrs. Pardo stood waiting with a candle of her own and an expression Keziah could not read at all. "He will dismiss me for it," Keziah said, before the housekeeper could speak first. "I had no business letting my boy up there. His Grace has not asked me to turn off a single soul since he came into the title, Mrs." Pardo said, "and I see no cause to think tonight will be the first time." She studied Keziah a moment longer than the words alone required. "You put a candle on his desk," she said. "It felt a hard thing to let a birthday pass with no light on it at all," Keziah said. "It was hard," Mrs. Pardo said, and something crossed her face that Keziah could not read. "Harder than you have any notion of." Mrs. Pardo held the candle a moment longer, as though weighing whether to say more, and then seemed to think better of it, and only reached out and set Keziah's shawl straighter on her shoulders, the way a woman does for a girl of her own, had she ever had one. Keziah did not press her for what she meant. She had learned that too, not to press for what was not offered freely, and there was proof enough scattered through that household every day of the week that pressing rarely got a person anything but trouble. She thanked the housekeeper for something she could not have named and went up to her narrow room above the laundry, and lay a long while listening to Amos breathe evenly beside her before she found her own rest, turning Mrs. Pardo's words over the way she had once turned over her mother's remedies, not understanding them yet, only trusting there was a reason behind them worth keeping. It was very nearly 2 years before that birthday, in the November of 1845, with the first hard frost of the season already whitening the stable yard by morning, that Keziah first came to understand something of the sort of house she had entered service in, though she would not have put a name to it at the time. She had been at Racombe only 10 weeks then, still learning which doors stuck and which back stairs to avoid at the hour the family might be crossing above, and still raw from the parting with Reuben, who had stayed behind in Taunton to keep what copying work he could find, because a live-in place for herself and a wage besides was more than either of them could afford to refuse that autumn, whatever it cost them in the seeing of each other. She had written to him every fortnight that first autumn, short practical letters about wages and weather, because neither of them had ever been much given to putting feeling onto a page when the page might be read by anybody else in a house full of curious eyes, and she had kept every one of his replies, folded into the same small tin that later held the wooden button, long after there was any practical reason left to keep them. Sowden, the head groom, gave an order in the yard, in the flat voice men use for things they would rather not have questioned twice. He was a heavy-set man of 50, with a groom's opinion of most things that walked on 2 legs rather than 4, and he stood that morning with his hands deep in his coat and his breath showing white in the cold, and told the stable boys plainly, as though it were a kindness to say it plainly, that the old hound was to be put down before the week was out. The dog, called Ringwood after some hunt of his father's that nobody living quite remembered the details of anymore, was blind these 2 years and deaf besides, and had been the 5th Duke's favorite in his hunting years, kept now, so the argument ran at the kennel's expense for nothing but the memory of what he had once been able to do. The present Duke could not hunt. There was, Sowden said, no sense in keeping an animal that could no longer earn its feed, and a kennel account that answered to nobody but a groom's own conscience was no account at all. It was not, in a year when bread itself wanted watching, an argument every man in the yard thought unreasonable, and more than one of the stable boys said as much over his own supper that night, though none of them said it loudly enough to reach Sowden's ear a second time. Keziah heard it from the yard with a basket of linen on her hip, the way she heard most household business that was never meant for her ears. She said nothing. Nobody had asked her opinion, and it was not her place to offer one. And if anyone had studied her face that afternoon, they would have found nothing in it but the ordinary tiredness of a woman with too much linen and too little time. She went out to the kennel that night, regardless, once the house had gone properly dark, with the crust end of her own supper knotted into a handkerchief, because she did not believe a creature ought to go hungry through what might be its last days on earth, whatever use it still had left in it. The dog was old and gray about the muzzle, one ear torn long ago in some hunt nobody living quite remembered, and it lay curled against the cold with the particular stillness of an animal that has stopped expecting comfort to come looking for it. She did not croon over it the way some of the younger girls did with the barn cats. She spoke to the dog in her ordinary voice, the one she used for anyone, and told it there was no sense being afraid of a little frost when there was bread to be had. And she stayed crouched beside it in the cold until it had eaten every last crumb she had brought, running its blind nose along her palm afterward as though counting what was left. It was little enough, a crust and a few minutes of company, and it cost her rather more than it looked like costing, in a season when her own boy's supper was not always certain either. But she had grown up watching her mother give away exactly this kind of nothing to exactly this kind of nobody, and had never once heard her call it a sacrifice. She never once looked back at the dark shape of the house behind her to see whether anybody was watching, because it never once occurred to her that anybody might be. In the morning, the order was never carried out. Souden was heard to complain in the tack room that somebody above him had changed his mind without troubling to explain why to a man who had to answer for the kennel accounts, and nobody in the servants' hall could say who or when, or on what grounds, and Keziah, folding linen with her thoughts already elsewhere, assumed it was Mrs. Pardoe's doing, and gave the matter no further thought for a long while after. It would be the better part of 2 years before she learned otherwise, and by then a good deal more than an old dog's life would be hanging on what else that library window had seen, and on how long a man could go on being kind to a household that had no idea it was being kept by him at all. The dog lived on after that November in the ordinary, undramatic way that a reprieved creature generally does, fed at the kennel, and let loose to wander the stable yard on the milder days, and Keziah made a habit, without ever quite deciding to make it a habit, of stopping to speak to him whenever her errands carried her that way, so that within the year the old hound had learned the particular sound of her step well enough to lift his blind head toward it before she had come near enough to touch him. She never once thought of it as anything more than an ordinary kindness owed to a creature that had done nothing to deserve its own neglect, and it did not occur to her, in all that time, to wonder whether anybody else in that great cold house had noticed the habit too, or thought the better of her for it. In the first week of November, with the birthday behind them, and the frost not yet come to stay, Mrs. Pardoe handed Keziah a list in her own careful hand and asked her to see it delivered before Sunday. A round of bread and coal owed to 6 households along the lane toward Chard, paid for out of the estate's winter charity, as it was every year the harvest ran short. Keziah had grown used to the round by then, and to the small private economy of her own days that ran alongside it, rising before the house stirred to see to the cordials and the preserves, then the round when it fell to her, then whatever fair copying had come by carrier, waiting for her in the evening once Amos was down, and the kitchen quiet enough to work by a single candle without anyone remarking on the waste of it. She had grown used, too, to its second kind of work that filled those evenings since Reuben's death, when Mr. Nunn's office at Taunton had begun sending her fair copying by carrier once a month. Deeds and leases and the odd will, paid by the sheet. Because a woman who could form a clean, legal hand and had once been a solicitor's copyist's wife was not a resource to be wasted, whatever else had passed between that office and her husband before he died. She did not ask why the work had started coming to her rather than lapsing when Reuben did. She was grateful enough not to question a kindness that arrived without explanation, and she had learned, in that house especially, that explanations were not always offered even when a person had earned one. The round took her the better part of a day. She left bread and a sack of coal at the Yandell cottage, where 2 children had been buried the winter before, and a third clung on thin and coughing by the fire, and Mrs. Yandell, taking the bread from her with both hands, said only that she did not know how they were to manage another winter like the last, and did not ask, because it was not her place to ask, how it was that the sack always seemed a little heavier than the estate's own accounting would account for. Keziah left the same at old Gillard's door, a cousin of her mother's on the far side of the parish, who could no longer stand steady enough to draw his own water, and who blessed her by her mother's name rather than her married one, the way the old people of that country still did. She called, too, at the Prowse cottage, where a widow near her own mother's age kept house alone with a grown son too simple to manage his own wages, and left bread there as well, and sat a quarter-hour longer than her errand strictly required, because the woman asked so little of anyone's time that Keziah found she could not begrudge her the giving of it. 6 houses in all, each one grateful in its own quiet way, none of them owing anything on paper for what they received, and none of them, Keziah thought as she walked the last mile home in the failing light, any the wiser as to why a household in a year like this one troubled itself so carefully over people who could never repay it. It was on her way back, delivering a completed lease copy to the estate office for the carrier to collect, that she happened to see the account book open on the clerk's table, the formal ledger that recorded every shilling the estate spent and every shilling it took in, and her eye, trained now by a year and more of legal copying to read a column the way another woman might read a face, went down the list of winter relief entered for that quarter. 5 households, not 6. She stood a moment with the lease copy still in her hand and read it again, in case her own tiredness had made the 6th line simply disappear before her eyes, and it had not. She did not say anything. It was not her place, and she had in any case no proof of anything beyond her own count against another woman's arithmetic, and arithmetic was easily wrong in a busy office at the end of a long month. She only noted it the way she noted most things that did not yet have an explanation attached to them, and went back to her work, and did not think of it again for some weeks. Lady Brantham arrived at Racombe in the 3rd week of November, with regrets so briefly worded that the footman had scarcely finished announcing her before the apology was spent, and Mr. Crispin Aylward arrived with her, as he generally did, a mild and pleasant-looking young man of 29, who had a way of agreeing with whoever had spoken last that some in the household mistook for good nature. The whole house seemed to draw itself up a little straighter the moment her carriage was heard. On the drive, Mrs. Pardoe going through the good rooms twice over to check that nothing had been left out of its proper place, and Keziah, watching the small flurry of preparation from the still-room doorway, understood without needing to be told that this particular visitor's opinion mattered to that household in a way few other visitors' opinions ever had. Drusilla, Dowager Countess of Brantham, was the late Duke's sister, and the only Aunt Gervase had living, a widow of some 28 years' standing, who moved through Racombe with the settled certainty of a woman who believed she had been managing the place, in all the particulars that mattered, since her nephew's accident had made him, in her own private estimation, no longer entirely equal to managing it himself. She was 58 that year, upright, carefully dressed, with a voice that Keziah never once heard raised, and a manner of looking at a room that seemed to be totting up its contents rather than simply seeing them. Drusilla, Dowager Countess of Brantham, was the late Duke's sister, and the only Aunt Gervase had living, a widow of some 28 years' standing, who moved through Raycombe with the settled certainty of a woman who believed she had been managing the place, in all the particulars that mattered, since her nephew's accident had made him, in her own private estimation, no longer entirely equal to managing it himself. She was 58 that year, upright, carefully dressed, with a voice that Keziah never once heard raised, and a manner of looking at a room that seemed to be totting up its contents rather than simply seeing them. She had brought a black bombazine that never once looked worn, though Keziah suspected, from the careful way it was pressed each morning by Miss Hoyle, that it had done a good many years of service already. And she wore no ornament. Keziah could see beyond a mourning ring for the late Earl, worn thin at the band, as though it had been turned on the finger a great many times by a hand thinking of something else entirely. Keziah was crossing the end of the gallery with a basket of linen on the day the Countess arrived, and felt, without quite being able to say how she knew it, that she had been noticed and accounted for in the same glance that took in the low stool still out of its usual place by the library hearth. Lady Brantham did not speak to her. She did not need to. Her eyes went from the stool to the corner of the desk where a small carved button had been left, forgotten, and then followed Keziah the length of the gallery until she turned the corner out of sight, and Keziah understood, though nobody had told her anything at all, that she had just been measured for some use not yet decided. Mr. Crispin was easier company, or seemed it. He found her in the passage the second day and asked her name with a warmth that felt, at first, like nothing more than ordinary friendliness, and remarked, glancing at the fair copy of a lease she was carrying to the post, that she had the hand of a woman who had been taught her letters properly, which was, he said, more than could be said for half the clerks he had known at his own solicitor's office in town. He asked lightly whether she had learned it from a husband or a father, and when she answered a husband, he said, with a smile that seemed entirely without malice, that a good clerk was a rarer thing to lose than most men understood, and passed on down the passage before she had properly settled what to make of the remark. He was, she came to think over the following weeks, a man whose charm cost him nothing to produce and asked nothing of him to sustain, which made it, in its own way, a harder thing to distrust than his aunt's cold civility, because a person naturally wishes to believe that warmth, wherever it is found, means something more than the accident of a pleasant face and an easy manner. It was only later, turning the exchange over as she fell asleep, that Keziah understood his kindness had been a kind of question, asked so pleasantly she had very nearly answered more of it than she meant to, and that a man who noticed the quality of a servant's handwriting within 2 days of arriving in a house was a man who noticed a great deal more than he troubled to say aloud. It was on the third evening, carrying a tray, past the closed door of the small parlor where the Countess and Mr. Nunn sat over the estate papers, that Keziah heard 3 words through the gap beneath the door, spoken by Lady Brantham in the same even tone she used for discussing the weather. The new act. She slowed without quite meaning to. The tray balanced on one hip and caught the low murmur of Mr. Nunn's voice answering something she could not make out. And then Lady Brantham again, briefer this time. A single word that might have been soon or might have been sound, she could not afterward be certain which. Nothing more reached her before the tray required both her hands again, and she had to move on, and she thought no more of it that night than she had thought of the missing sixth household on the ledger. Filing it away in the same place, she kept things she did not yet have the shape of, trusting the way she trusted most unfinished things, that a shape would come to it eventually, whether she went looking for one or not. The weeks that followed settled into their own quiet rhythm, the sort a household falls into without anyone deciding it should. Mornings given over to the cordials and the ordinary business of the still room, afternoons to whatever errand needed running, evenings to Amos, who had begun that autumn to string whole sentences together, where before he had managed only single defiant words, and who announced, with the same fierce confidence he brought to everything, that he intended to be a groom when he grew tall enough, having formed a great attachment to Sowden's horses that Sowden himself bore with more patience than Keziah would have credited him for a year before. Lady Brantham kept to herself for the most part in those weeks, taking her meals apart and conducting whatever business occupied her behind closed doors, and Keziah, watching her from a careful distance, thought there was something almost restful in the Countess's stillness, the way there is something restful in watching weather gather before a storm finally breaks. A person at least knows, in the gathering, that something is coming, even if she cannot yet say what shape it will take. It was 10 days before Christmas that Mrs. Pardoe asked Keziah to help turn out the old estate boxes kept in the housekeeper's room. Papers going back years that nobody had sorted since the 5th Duke's time, and it was there, near the bottom of the 3rd box, that Keziah's hand closed on a small book bound in black leather, its pages filled edge to edge in a hand she now knew as well as her own, close and economical, with no flourish wasted on it anywhere. It was not the estate ledger. It was a private account, kept apart from any clerk's eye, and it took her only a few lines to understand what kind of account it was. Coal, 3 sacks. The 4th cottage on Church Lane. No invoice raised. A debt to the corn merchant at Chard, settled in full. The debtor never informed who had settled it. A line, dated the autumn after her own arrival, noting only that the child might remain in the house with his mother. No further comment offered, as though the matter had required no more thought than the coal. Further back, entries she recognized without needing to check them against anything, since she had carried the results of half of them up the lane herself not 3 weeks before. Bread and coal, 6 households, though the formal book she had glimpsed in the estate office named only 5. She understood now where the 6th had gone, and understood too that whoever kept this second book had never once meant for the arithmetic of it to be admired by anybody. And then, near the middle of the book, a date in February of 1846. Mr. H. Beddoe, surgeon, called after midnight, paid in full, not to give his name, not to send a bill. The address written beside it was her own, the lodging in Taunton where Reuben had died. Folded into the same page, gone soft at its creases from being opened and closed more than once, was a second sheet, a fair copy of the very instruction the ledger described, written out in a clear legal hand for some file she could not guess at, and the hand was Reuben's. She knew it the way she knew her own name. She had watched him form exactly those letters across a kitchen table for 4 years of marriage, copy on deeds by candlelight for pennies a sheet, and here it was again, dated in the last days of his life, 3 weeks, near as she could reckon it before the fever took him. Her husband had sat somewhere, sick already, or not yet knowing he was dying, and had copied out by his own hand the order that would send a physician to save his son. And he had never told her a single word of it. She could not tell, turning the paper over twice in the poor light of the housekeeper's room, whether he had known whose household he was copying, for, when he took up the pen, whether the address had meant anything to him at all beyond a line to be reproduced faithfully for whatever fee the work paid, or whether he had understood every word of it and had simply run out of time in the end to say so to her. It was a question she turned over that whole winter, and never once arrived at an answer she could trust, and she came, eventually, to think that not knowing was itself a kind of legacy he had left her, alongside the button and the coat and the debts that were no longer owed. She sat down on the floor of the housekeeper's room, with the ledger open across her knees, and did not cry. She had learned some years before, over a grave a good deal harder to bear than this one, not to cry where anyone might see, and there was no reason in the world to think that lesson would fail her now. Sitting alone among boxes nobody had opened in years, holding evidence of a kindness two men had given her without either of them once claiming credit for it, one of them now beyond thanking, and the other close enough to thank that she did not yet know what she was going to do about it. She closed the ledger at last and folded the fair copy back into its crease exactly as she had found it, and put both away in the box where they had lain hidden for a year and more, because it was not yet her secret to disturb, whatever else it had become to her. Mrs. Pardoe found her some minutes later still kneeling among the boxes, and asked, with a sharpness that was mostly concern, whether she had taken a chill, and Keziah said only that the room was colder than she had thought, and went back to her sorting with hands that did not, she was fairly certain, shake badly enough for anyone to notice. The gallery scene came a week after that, on an afternoon Lady Brantham had arranged with a precision Keziah did not fully appreciate until it was already happening around her. Two families from the neighboring parishes had been invited to call, a small, unremarkable courtesy on its face, tea, and a turn about the gallery to admire the old portraits, the sort of afternoon no one would trouble to remember by itself. The two visiting families, a Mr. and Mrs. Selwood with their grown daughter, and an elderly baronet named Sir Aldous Penhale, who had known the 5th Duke slightly in his own younger days, arrived promptly at 3, and Keziah, passing through the servants' passage with an armful of fresh linen, caught a glimpse of Lady Brantham greeting them at the gallery door with a warmth that struck her, even at a distance and even without yet understanding its purpose, as somehow rehearsed. Keziah had been sent up with a message for Mrs. Pardoe when the ordinary bad luck of household timing put her at the far end of the long gallery at the very moment Cobb wheeled the Duke's chair through it, with Amos, who had slipped his mother's hand entirely, trotting alongside with one small fist wrapped around a spoke of the near wheel as though it were the most natural companion in the world, laughing each time the chair turned and swung him half off his feet. "How touching," Lady Brantham said to the room at large, in a voice pitched exactly to carry the length of the gallery. "The still-room maid's boy has taken quite a fancy to his grace." Keziah went very still. "I beg your pardon, my lady," she said. "I imagine you do," said Lady Brantham, and her smile did not move as far as her eyes. "What is a broken duke to a woman in your position, if not a very convenient sort of misfortune? A man who cannot chase you off his knee, and cannot, one imagines, chase very much else besides. You have found yourself a most comfortable situation." Someone in the visiting party laughed, a small, ugly sound quickly swallowed. Keziah did not cry. She had learned that too, a long time before this gallery, over a grave that had asked considerably more of her than this one did. She felt her hands go very still at her sides, the same stillness she kept instead of tears, and she looked at Lady Brantham and answered in a voice that did not rise and did not shake. "My son does not know his grace is a duke, my lady," she said. "He only knows he is kind to him. I had not thought that a fault in a child, to love what is kind to him." "That is not insolence, I hear, is it?" said Lady Brantham. "It is not insolence at all, my lady," Keziah said. "It is only that I have never learned to say a plain thing sideways, and I am sorry if the plainness of it offends you." It was Gervase who spoke next, in the quiet voice that Keziah would learn, before that winter was out, carried a good deal further than any raised one could have managed. "That will do, Aunt," he said. "I only wonder that you troubled to invite an audience for it in advance. I had not thought even you would plan a thing so carefully and still call it an accident of timing." The color went out of Lady Brantham's face and came back twice as high, but she did not retreat, not the way a woman retreats when she has lost a point. She turned instead to the elder of the two visiting gentlemen, as smoothly as if the last minute had never happened at all, and asked him, in the same untroubled voice she had used for everything else that afternoon, whether he still kept an acquaintance among the men of business at Lincoln's Inn. Keziah did not understand the question, and would not understand it for some weeks yet, and it was only much later that she came to see it had not been a question at all, but the sound of a woman setting down one card in order to pick up another. Keziah curtsied, because the moment demanded the form of it, even if her heart did not, and gathered Amos up against her hip, and did not let herself shake until she had turned 2 full corners out of anyone's sight, and stood a moment in the cold of the back stair, with her son's small weight the only steady thing she could feel anywhere in her own body. Behind her, faintly through the gallery door, she heard the wheels of the chair start forward again, and Cobb's low voice saying something she could not make out, and beneath it, or so she thought, though she could not afterward have sworn to it, something that might have been Gervase telling his valet, in a tone gone flat with an anger he was keeping carefully out of his face, for the sake of the room he still sat in, that the visit had gone on long enough for one afternoon. Keziah handed in her notice the following morning, before the household was properly awake, writing the letter at the kitchen table by a single candle in a hand steadier than she felt. She told herself it was arithmetic and not pride that drove her to it, and it was true enough, though not the whole truth. A widow with a fatherless son could not afford to be made sport of by a countess who held, in practice, a good deal more sway in that house than its own master did from his chair, and a woman turned off without a character. In a year when the newspapers were still full of what had been found in the Andover workhouse, the bones gnawed bare by paupers too hungry to wait for the pot could not count on finding another situation. And a woman with no situation and no character had, in the end, only the parish to fall back on. And the parish meant the workhouse, and the workhouse, everybody knew by then, meant a mother and her son kept in separate wards and allowed to see each other, if they were allowed at all, for 1 hour on a Sunday, through a doorway with a matron standing in it counting the minutes. She had held Amos a great deal tighter than usual the night she wrote the letter, and had told herself it was only the cold. Mrs. Pardoe read the letter standing in the doorway of the still room, and did not, for a long moment, say anything at all. "You would leave over her," she said, finally. "It was not quite a question." "I would leave for my son," Keziah said. "It amounts to the same thing," said Mrs. Pardoe, "and I think you know it, or you would not look so wretched writing it." She folded the letter without reading further, and put it into her apron pocket rather than laying it on the tray, where such letters usually went. "Give me a fortnight," she said, "before this goes up to his grace. There is a thing I ought to have told you a good while before now, and I have been a coward about it, which is not a discovery I am proud to have made about myself at my age." Crispin found her 2 days later in the still room, where she had gone to see to the last of the season's preserving, steam fogging the small window above the copper while she worked, and he did not come in the manner of a man delivering a threat, which was, She came to think afterward the most unsettling thing about the whole quarter hour. "I understand you have given notice," he said, without preamble, standing just inside the doorway as though he were not entirely sure of his welcome there, which he was not. "I have, sir," Keziah said. He turned his hat over once in his hands, a gesture she would come to recognize in him as the nearest thing he had to honesty. "I will not pretend I am sorry for the reason of it," he said. "My aunt is not a woman who troubles herself over the harm she does, provided the harm lands somewhere convenient to her. But I did want to say, before you go, that I understand something of what it is to be made use of by people with more standing than yourself, and I am sorry for it, whatever that is worth to you." "It is worth something, sir," she said, though she did not say how little. He told her then in the plain unhappy way of a man, confessing a debt to a stranger because he could not bear to confess it to anyone who mattered, that he owed something near £1,400, that the rents on what little land his father had left him had come in at less than half what they ought this year, with the harvest what it had been, and that his aunt, whatever else she was, had never once in his life asked his opinion before deciding what use to make of him. He offered her, then, a sum of money, not large, but not nothing either, to see her settled somewhere quiet with her boy, away from Racombe and away from whatever his aunt intended to make of her. "You ought to take it," he said, and there was nothing cruel in the way he said it, which was worse, somehow, than cruelty would have been. "She does not ask me before she acts. She will not ask you either." Keziah did not take it. She told him, as plainly as she had told his aunt in the gallery, that she would not be paid to disappear from a house she had done no wrong in, and he did not press her, only nodded, as though he had expected exactly this answer and had made the offer more from a wish to have made it than any real hope it would be accepted. He sat a moment longer on the edge of a preserving table he had no business sitting on, turning his hat over once more, and said, almost to himself, that he envied her the plainness of it, the being able to simply refuse a thing and mean it, since he had spent the better part of his own life agreeing to things he did not mean, because agreement had always seemed the easier road to travel. "My father quarreled with her once," he said unexpectedly, as he turned to go, "over some matter of a will years before I was old enough to understand it. He never spoke of it again, after, not once in all the years I knew him, and I used to think it was because he had lost the argument. I am not so sure of that now as I once was. He left before she could ask him what he meant by it, and she did not see him again for the better part of a week, and did not, for some while yet, think to wonder why a grown man should carry a quarrel of his father's like a stone in his pocket, turned over so often the edges of it had gone smooth. She thought of her own father instead, dead these many years, and rarely spoken of even by her mother, and considered that perhaps every family carried some such stone, worn smooth by handling, and that the only real difference between one family and another was how honestly they answered a stranger who asked to see it. Mrs. Pardoe kept her word on the 9th day of the notice, finding Keziah in the still room in the last hour before supper, and shutting the door behind her with the particular firmness of a woman who meant to be heard out before she could be interrupted. "I want to tell you a thing," she said, "and I want you to let me finish it before you say a word, because I have turned it over the better part of a fortnight, and I will lose my nerve if you stop me partway." Keziah set down the jar she was labeling and waited. "You know now what is in that black book," Mrs. Pardoe said. "I saw your face the day you found it, whatever you thought you were hiding. I will not ask how much of it you understood. But there is a piece of it you cannot have from the book alone, because it was never written down anywhere. And I think you ought to have it before you leave this house, believing you are nothing to him but an embarrassment his aunt exposed in a gallery. He asked me your name, she went on, the week you first came here. You had been at Raycombe not 10 days, and the boy who ought to have carried the coal up the back stairs was laid up with a fever, and you carried it yourself rather than trouble anyone, 3 flights, twice a day, and never once complained of it to me or to anyone. He saw you at it from the library window one morning, and he asked me who you were. I did not think much of the asking at the time. I think a great deal more of it now. And the physician, Keziah said, that was his own doing. His own doing entirely, Mrs. Pardo said. Sent for at 2 in the morning on his own order, with no one's leave asked and no one's knowledge wanted, and I was told twice, not once, twice, that his name was never to be given. I do not know why he wanted it kept so close. He has never told me in a year and more since, and I have never asked him, because it did not seem a thing a body ought to ask, a man who had gone to such trouble not to be asked it. Keziah asked the only question she had left in her. Why? I do not know why, Mrs. Pardo said. That much is the truth. Whatever else I have kept from you, I have my own idea of it, if you want it, though it is only an old woman's guess, and worth no more than that. I think he is afraid of you. I have thought so a good while now, watching the pair of you in the same room without either one of you saying above 10 words to the other. Afraid of me, Keziah said. I am a still roommate, Mrs. Pardo. You are that, Mrs. Pardo said. And you are also, unless I mistake the signs of it entirely, the first honest thing that has walked into this house in 3 years. And honesty is a fearsome thing to a man who has spent his whole life surrounded by people telling him only what they thought he wished to hear. I do not think he knows what to do with a woman who tells him the truth about a well, or a dog, or himself, without once asking anything of him in return for the telling. It was a fortnight past that conversation, in the second week of the notice she had still not been permitted to make final, that Keziah began to notice a pattern in her own still-room work that she could not, at first, put any proper name to. Every preparation that came into the house from the apothecary passed through her hands to be logged and shelved, tonics and cordials, and the small brown bottles the physician at Chard sent up once a fortnight for his Grace's general strength. And it was in the ordinary course of that logging that she began to see the shape of something she did not like. A new bottle would arrive, and the second day after it was opened, Gervase would be found confused in a way she had never once seen him confused before. The accident had touched anything but his legs, forgetting Cobb's name mid-sentence, losing the thread of a report he had been reading aloud not an hour before, his hands unsteady enough that he set his pen down rather than risk the page. And then, as the bottle emptied toward its last week, he would sharpen again, as surely as a tide turning, until by the day the bottle was finished, he was entirely himself, sharp-eyed and quick-tongued, and a new bottle would arrive within days, and the whole slow tide would turn again. She was her mother's daughter enough to know what such a pattern generally meant, though she did not yet know what agent produced it. Her mother had kept a whole shelf of her own remedies, with careful notes beside each one of what too much of a good thing could do to a body, and Keziah had grown up hearing those notes read aloud like a catechism, until the shapes of poisoning and healing had come to seem, in her own mind, less like opposites than like two ends of the very same rope, and it was that old half-remembered lesson that made her trust her own eyes now rather than doubt them, she thought, watching him fumble for Cobb's name one gray afternoon and find it again only after a visible struggle, of a particular remedy her mother had once refused to keep in the house at all, on the grounds that a thing capable of curing in small measure was too often capable of killing in large, and that no household was the safer for keeping such a thing within easy reach of a careless or an unkind hand. She held one bottle back, a third empty, rather than sending it down to be broken up with the rest, and hid it behind the lavender water in the still room's deepest cupboard, and told no one, because she had as yet nothing to tell that would not sound like the fancy of a woman looking for reasons to distrust a countess who had already given her every reason in the world. He sent for her on the 11th day of the notice, not through Mrs. Pardoe this time, but by his own hand, a note carried down by Cobb, asking whether Mrs. Vellicott might spare him a quarter hour in the small morning room at whatever time suited her, and adding, in a line struck through once and then left standing anyway, that he would understand entirely if she preferred not to come at all. She went. She told herself it was only the ordinary courtesy owed an employer, and did not believe herself for a moment. The small morning room faced east and caught what little warmth the afternoon still had to give, and it was, she would come to think, the only room in that enormous house that had ever felt built for two people rather than for the admiring of strangers from a distance. A fire had been lit, though the day did not strictly require it. Tea sat untouched on the low table between them. He had positioned his chair by the window, not looking down at the drive this time, but at the door, waiting for her, and she noticed, crossing the threshold, that his hands were folded very still in his lap, in a way that told her, before he had spoken a single word, how carefully he had rehearsed whatever he meant to say, and how little that rehearsing had actually settled his own nerves. "You handed in your notice," he said, before she had properly crossed the threshold. "I did, Your Grace. Because of my aunt. Because of a great many small things, Your Grace, of which your aunt was only the loudest." He studied her a long moment, the way he had once studied a wooden button on a birthday, as though trying to commit something to memory before he could lose the shape of it again. "I have not been honest with you," he said, "and now that the moment has come to correct that, I find I do not know quite how to begin, so I will simply begin badly, and trust you to forgive the clumsiness of it." She said nothing. She had learned in that house to let a silence often do its own work rather than filling it out of nervousness. "The physician who came for your son. The debt at Chard that was never called in. The coal that turned up at your door with no bill attached. Mrs. Pardoe has told you, I think, or you would not be looking at me the way you are looking at me now." He drew a breath. "I did none of it out of duty, whatever my aunt believes of me. I am not, whatever else I am, a man who extends that particular kindness to every servant under this roof with equal care." "Why me, then?" she said. "Because I watched you some months before any of that feed a dying dog with the last of your own bread, at an hour you believed no living soul was awake to see it, and asked nothing of anyone for it afterward. Not thanks, not notice, not so much as a kind word from the groom who had ordered it destroyed. I wanted to know what sort of woman does a costly thing for a creature that can never repay her and expects nothing in return for having done it. I have spent the better part of 2 years finding out from a distance I told myself was discretion, and which was, if I am honest with you now, a good deal closer to cowardice." "You watched me," she said slowly, "from the library window." "I did, and you never said." "I did not know how to say it without it sounding like a purchase," he said. "A duke who buys a physician for a maid's son and then presents her with the bill of it in exchange for her good opinion. I did not want your gratitude, Mrs. Vellicott. I did not think I had earned the right to want anything more than that from you, and I am not entirely certain I have earned it now." The fire shifted once in the grate. Somewhere below, faint through the floor, Amos's laughter carried up the back stairs, entirely unconcerned with anything being decided above him. "Why the dog?" she said at last, because it was the smallest of all the questions crowding her, and the only one she trusted her voice to carry. Of everything you might have chosen to watch for, why did that convince you? Because no one was going to reward you for it, he said. No one was ever going to know. I have spent my whole life surrounded by people who are generous precisely when it is observed and profitable to be seen being generous. I had begun to believe that was the whole of what kindness ever was. In practice, whatever the sermon said of it. You taught me otherwise without once knowing you were teaching me anything at all. He looked down at his own folded hands, the only part of him, she thought, that had never quite learned to hold itself perfectly steady. I am not offering you anything tonight, he said. I want to be plain with you about that, because I think you have had enough of being managed by people with more power than yourself. I am not asking you to answer me now, and I will think no less of you, whatever you decide. I would rather have your honest refusal freely given than a yes you felt cornered into giving a man who cannot even rise from this chair to see you properly to the door. You think that matters to me, she said. The chair. I think it has mattered to a great many people who claim to love me before it, he said. And I have stopped assuming, merely because I wish it otherwise, that it will matter to no one at all. Then you have been watching the wrong sort of woman for 2 years, she said. And something in her own voice was not quite steady for the first time that whole evening. I did not come to care for you on account of your legs, your grace, nor in spite of them. I came to care for you the evening a boy climbed onto your lap with a wooden button in his fist, and you let him stay, when you might so easily have sent him off, and no soul in this house would have blamed you for it. I loved you a little for that. Before I ever learned what you had done for my son in the dark of a night, I very nearly did not survive myself. Say that again, he said. Slowly, I find I want to be certain I have heard it correctly. I loved you a little, she said, before I knew what you had done. I love you considerably more now that I do. That is the whole of my answer, Your Grace, and I find I do not require a fortnight to give it, though it was kind of you to offer me one. He asked then whether he might take her hand, and she gave it, and he drew the glove from it himself, finger by finger, with the same unhurried care he had once given a wooden button, as though it were the only object of value in the room, and he did not let go of it again for a long while after. I would ask one thing of you, she said, when she trusted her voice again. Whatever comes, and I think your aunt means, for a great deal to come, I would be spoken to plainly, not managed, not spared unwelcome truths the way a man spares a thing he thinks too delicate to bear them. I have had enough of people deciding, on my behalf, what I am strong enough to hear. You have my word on it, he said. It is, I think, very nearly the only thing left in this house that my aunt cannot take from me, and I find I would rather give the whole of it to you than keep any part of it in reserve against a day I might need it more. She stayed a while longer in that small warm room, after the worst of what needed saying had been said, the tea gone cold between them and neither of them minding it. And it was only when the light outside had faded past any pretense of afternoon that she rose at last to go, and he asked, in a voice that had lost some of its earlier careful formality, whether she would come again tomorrow, not for any business of the house, but only to sit as she had sat that evening, and she told him she would, and found, walking back down to the still room afterward, that she meant it more entirely than she had meant very much else in a long while. It was 3 days after that evening that Cobb came to find Keziah near 11 at night, his face gone the color of old tallow, and told her what he had overheard at the inn in Ilminster, where he had gone to see to a horse, and had stayed rather longer than the errand required once he understood what was being discussed in the next room. The petition to the Court of Chancery that Mr. Nunn had been so occupied preparing an answer to, the one the whole house had assumed was Lady Brantham's true weapon. was nothing of the sort. It was a decoy, meant only to keep the solicitor's attention fixed on one door while the real one opened behind his back. The true instrument, Cobb said, lay folded in Dr. Rookie's own traveling case and consisted of an order signed by Lady Brantham as next of kin, together with 2 medical certificates, sufficient under the new Act to have His Grace removed to a licensed house before the week was out, and certainly before any hearing could be held at which he might be seen to answer for himself. A man not present at his own inquiry, Cobb had gathered from the talk in the taproom, was a man very unlikely to win it. Kezia sat a long moment with that, turning it the way she had once turned Mrs. Pardoe's unfinished sentences, until the shape of it came clear to her, all at once, the way a badly drawn deed sometimes came clear only on the 3rd reading. She had copied enough certificates and orders in her year at Mr. Nunn's work to know the form of such papers by heart, though she had never once thought to need the knowledge for anything but a few pence a sheet. 2 certificates, she said aloud, to no one but the dark of the passage around her, signed by whom? Dr. Rookie's carriage came up the drive a little after 9 the following evening, exactly as Cobb had heard it would, and Kezia was waiting for it on the front steps with a lantern and a composure she did not entirely feel. Mrs. Pardoe at her shoulder, and Cobb a pace behind them both. She did not attempt to bar the door. She had turned the problem over most of the previous night, lying awake beside Amos, with her mind running the same narrow circle again and again, and had come to understand that a still-room maid standing in a doorway was nothing at all against a signed order, but a still-room maid who could read the order correctly and say so aloud in front of witnesses was a different matter entirely. It was, she thought, very nearly the only weapon a woman in her position had ever been allowed to carry, the plain fact of what a paper actually said. And she had spent 4 years married to a man who had taught her, without either of them quite meaning it as instruction, how to read one properly. "I should like to see the certificates, if you please, sir," she said to Rook as he stepped down, before he had so much as reached the door. Rook was a heavy, unhurried man who looked at her the way he might have looked at a chair that had spoken. "This is no business of a servant's," he said. "It is the business of anyone standing in this doorway when a man is carried out of it against his own wish," Kezia said, and held out her hand. For a moment neither of them moved, Rook plainly weighing whether it was worth the delay to argue the point with a servant on her own master's steps, and Kezia keeping her hand out and her eyes level with his own, until at last, and rather more to his own visible surprise than to hers, he produced the papers rather than argue further, in front of an audience that now included his own driver. She read them by the lantern light, with a steadiness she had to work to hold in her hands, and found what she had gone looking for within the first 2 lines of each. Both certificates were dated the same day. Both gave the same hour. The Act was plain on the point. She had copied enough of its language in the months since it passed to know it near enough by heart that no 2 persons might certify the same patient from a single joint examination, that each medical man must see him separately and record when he had done so. "They bear the same hour, sir," she said, holding the papers so that Mrs. Pardoe and Cobb might see them too. "Both of them. I do not think 2 examinations were held at all." Rookie's unhurried manner deserted him rather quickly after that. He said something about a clerical error, and something further about the impropriety of a servant presuming to interpret an Act of Parliament. But he took the papers back and returned to his carriage without his patient, because whatever else was, he was a man with a license to protect, and a license, unlike a countess's temper, could be taken from him by the very commissioners the Act had created to watch men exactly like him. It was a small victory, and Kezia understood, watching the carriage turn back down the drive, that it had cost her something as well as won her something. Lady Brantham would not make the same mistake twice, and would know, by morning, precisely which servant in that house had cost her the game. Mrs. Pardoe said as much, standing beside her in the cold after the carriage lamps had dwindled to nothing on the turnpike road. "You have made yourself an enemy tonight in a way you were not before," she said, not unkindly, only plainly, the way she said most things that mattered. "I hope you were prepared for the cost of it before you opened your hand for those papers." Kezia said that she had not been prepared for it at all, and had done it anyway, and Mrs. Pardoe, after a moment, said that this was very often how the costliest things got done. She was right to expect the cost. The Inquisition itself was fixed for the second week of February, at the Castle Hotel in Taunton, before a commissioner named Frayne and a jury of 23 men, most of them landholders and tradesmen of the county who had never in their lives been asked to decide whether a man's mind belonged to himself or to somebody else. The weeks between the small victory at the gate and the hearing itself passed in a strange, suspended fashion, ordinary household business continuing much as it always had. Cordials stopped and preserves counted, and Amos growing another inch, it seemed almost weekly, while underneath that ordinary surface everyone in the house who mattered went about their days with the particular watchfulness of people waiting for a single date on a calendar to arrive and settle, one way or another, everything that hung upon it. Kezia traveled down the day before with Mrs. Pardoe, who had insisted on coming despite her own place at Raycombe hanging by the same thin thread as everybody else's, and the two of them took a single small room at an inn near the Castle Hotel, sharing a bed the way sisters might. And neither of them slept a great deal that night, listening to each other's breathing, and the town clock striking the hours until a gray, reluctant dawn finally gave them leave to rise. Kezia saw Miss Hoyle come out of the room where Gervase had passed the night before the hearing, early in the morning before the house was properly stirring, and thought nothing of it beyond a passing surprise that Lady Brantham's own maid should have business there at all. She would not understand the meaning of that sight for some weeks yet, and by then it would have cost them a great deal more than a morning's confusion. The jury looked at the wheeled chair before they looked at the man in it. Kezia saw it happen, sitting in the gallery reserved for such spectators as the case drew, packed shoulder to shoulder with the curious and the concerned in equal measure, and understood, watching 23 faces take in the chair before they had heard a single word from its occupant, that a battle had already been half lost before the first witness was called. She thought of her mother, who had once told her that a wound a person could see always frightened a stranger more than a wound they could not, whatever the truth of either one, and had never until that moment understood how much a jury box was simply a room full of strangers. He answered well for the first 40 minutes, better than well. He recited the rent rolls from memory without once faltering, corrected a figure the opposing counsel had got wrong by £11, spoke of the water report and the parish accounts, with a clarity that made the counsel for Lady Brantham visibly recalculate his line of questioning twice, pausing once to consult his own papers as though he had expected an easier morning than the one he was being given. Kezia allowed herself, in that first hour, something dangerously close to hope, and found herself, more than once, gripping the rail of the gallery hard enough to whiten her own knuckles without quite noticing she had done it. The afternoon undid it. He began to lose the thread of his own sentences somewhere past 2 o'clock, called Cobb by a name that was not Cobb's, stopped in the middle of an account of the well at Raycombe Magna, and could not, for the better part of a minute, find his way back into it. his hand going once to his temple as though he could press the missing thread back into place by force, looking out at the gallery once, toward Keziah, with an expression she would carry with her a long while after. The look of a man watching himself fail from some small distance outside his own body and unable to do anything to stop it. The opposing counsel, to his credit or his shame, did not press the advantage cruelly. He did not need to. The jury had already seen enough for themselves. The bottle of proof she had hidden behind the lavender water sat 18 miles away in a cupboard at Rackham, and she was not permitted to leave the hearing to fetch it, and would not, in any case, have known how to make 23 jurymen believe a still-room maid's word over a licensed surgeon's testimony, even if she had. Beddoe and Rook were called and gave their evidence under oath, careful and measured and entirely consistent with the papers. Rook had shown her on the doorstep the second corrected set, dated properly this time, a week apart, exactly as the act required. Beddoe, called first, spoke of a general decline in his Grace's faculties observed over several visits, a want of steadiness in the hand, a tendency to lose the thread of ordinary conversation, and answered every question put to him in a voice so carefully colorless that Keziah, watching from the gallery, thought she had never heard a man work so hard to say so little that could later be proven false. Rook, following him, added only that he had formed the same impression independently, on a separate examination, a claim the corrected certificates now supported on paper, whatever the truth of the matter had been in fact. The two families who had witnessed the scene in the Long Gallery in December were called as well, and spoke. In careful phrases their own solicitor had plainly helped them find beforehand, of an unusual attachment to a woman in service. A fixation, the elder gentleman called it, that had struck him at the time as rather more than ordinary kindness, and which he now understood, in the light of subsequent events, to have been a symptom rather than a virtue. The jury deliberated 40 minutes. Keziah counted every one of them by the clock over the hotel's own mantel, and did not move from her seat, and did not let herself hope past the first 10, because hope past the first 10 had begun to feel, by then, like a kind of carelessness she could no longer afford. When the foreman rose, she already knew, from the set of his shoulders before he spoke a single word, what the finding would be: of unsound mind and incapable of managing himself and his affairs. The words landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. A small plain sound, followed by a great deal of movement nobody could quite account for. Afterward, chairs scraping, someone's cough, the commissioner's own gavel coming down once to settle a room that had not, in truth, made very much noise at all. Keziah sat through the whole of it with her hands folded in her lap in the same stillness she had learned over her own husband's grave, and did not trust herself to look at Gervase, because she did not think either of their faces could afford, just then, to see what was written on the others. The consequences of it arrived within 5 days, exactly as the law provided for. Crispin Aylward was named nothing at all in the order that came down from London, and it took him, by Keziah's later reckoning, no more than a single reading of the document to understand what that meant about the true shape of his aunt's affection for him. He had come to Rackham, she supposed, half believing that whatever his aunt gained, he stood to gain some portion of alongside her, the natural expectation of an heir presumptive watching his own inheritance managed by someone else's hand. The order left him nothing but a discretionary allowance, granted or withheld entirely at his aunt's pleasure, and Keziah heard, second-hand and much later, that he had read the document twice through in silence before setting it down and asking, of no one in the room in particular, what use he had ever been to her at all beyond a name to put on the petition. Lady Brantham was named both Committee of the Estate and Committee of the Person in the same order, the whole of Gervase Aylward's fortune, and the whole of his body delivered into the same pair of hands by the same stroke of the same pen. Kezia was dismissed within the day, without a character, by the new committee's own authority, delivered to her, not in person, but by a note in a clerk's unfamiliar hand, and she left Rackham Abbey on a gray morning in February, with Amos on her hip, a single trunk behind her on a borrowed cart, and old Ringwood trotting along behind them both because nobody in that house had thought, in the confusion of it all, to shut a gate against a dog that had nowhere else in the world it particularly wanted to be. She did not look back at the house as the cart carried her down the drive, the same drive she had once watched stay empty as a held breath on a birthday nobody had come to, and told herself there was nothing left in it worth the looking. She took a room above a chandler's shop in Taunton, in the same narrow street where Reuben had once lodged and died, because it was cheap and because some bitter, unexamined part of her thought it fitting that she should end where he had ended. The room held a bed, a stool, a small grate that smoked when the wind came from the west, and 6 weeks of coin between herself and whatever came after that, a boy not yet 3 who did not understand why they had left the only house he had ever known, and a blind dog too old and too devoted to be sent away, who took up more of the narrow floor than any of them could properly spare, and was fed anyway, out of whatever there was, because she had never once, in the whole of her life, learned how to do otherwise. She took in washing where she could find it and copying where Mr. None could still quietly send it her way, and told herself most nights that 6 weeks was a very great deal of time, and did not most nights believe herself. The chandler downstairs, a kindly enough man named Perce, who asked no questions of his tenants beyond the punctual paying of rent, remarked once that he had known Reuben Vellacott a little, in a passing way, from the years he had lodged nearby, and told her, awkwardly, that he had been sorry to hear of his death, and Kezia thanked him, and said nothing further, because there was nothing further she trusted herself to say on the subject to a stranger, however kindly meant the remark had been. Mr. Nunn found her there within the first week, standing in her doorway with his hat in both hands, in very much the manner Crispin had once stood in the still room and told her that he too had been dismissed from the family service, the new committee having engaged a solicitor of its own, choosing within days of the verdict, a man with no history of independence to correct for. He looked, standing there, considerably older than the brisk, confident man who had once explained rent rolls to a countess without troubling to raise his voice, and Kezia found herself, despite everything the past weeks had cost her, feeling a measure of pity for him that she had not expected to feel for any grown man so comfortably placed in the world as a solicitor generally was. And then he told her a second thing, harder for him to say than the first. "I dismissed your husband," he said, "in the December of 1843. I have never, in all the years since, been entirely easy in my own mind about the doing of it." "Why did you dismiss him?" she asked, though something in her had already begun, without quite knowing why, to hold its breath for the answer. "I do not know," Mr. Nunn said, and had the grace to look ashamed of the admission, turning his hat over in his hands, the way Crispin once had, as though the gesture were catching among men who had failed her husband in one way or another. "The instruction came to me from above, and I was not in a position then to ask questions of the person who gave it. I have wondered a great many times since whether I ought to have asked anyway, whatever it might have cost me to do it. I think, looking back on it now, that it is a question a man ought to have asked before it became too late to matter, and not after, when the asking can only ease his own conscience and nobody else's burden." He did not say who had given the instruction, because he did not know, and Kezia did not press him for a guess. She was not yet ready to hear spoken aloud, though the shape of it had already begun, somewhere at the back of her mind, to gather itself into something with a face and a name. It was a notice in the Taunton Courier, a fortnight after her dismissal, that told her where they had taken him. Curdley House, the item read, a licensed establishment some 11 miles distant, kept by Dr. Silas Rook, for the benefit of His Grace's health and the quiet management of his affairs during his present indisposition, the phrasing so carefully bloodless that a stranger reading it might have believed the man himself had chosen to go there for a rest cure. Kezia read the notice 3 times over before the meaning of it settled properly into her, sitting at Mr. Nunn's own small table with the newspaper, still smelling faintly of the printer's ink, and felt, reading it, a particular kind of anger she had not allowed herself to feel through the whole of the Inquisition itself, the anger of a woman watching a plain fact dressed up in language, soft enough to fool anybody who had not lived through the truth of it. Kezia walked the distance the following day, because she had no coin to spare for a carriage, and because sitting still with the knowledge of where he was had become a great deal harder to bear than walking 11 miles in the cold. Kezia walked the distance the following day, because she had no coin to spare for a carriage, and because sitting still with the knowledge of where he was had become a great deal harder to bear than walking 11 miles in the cold. She carried Amos most of the way on her hip, changing him from one arm to the other when the first grew tired, and stopped twice to let him walk a little on his own small legs so that her own might rest, and thought, more than once along that road, of all the other roads she had walked in her life, for reasons that mattered a great deal more than her own comfort, to a sick bed, to a kennel, to a gallows of a courtroom, and wondered whether a person's whole life might be measured out, in the end, by nothing grander than the roads she had been willing to walk and the reasons she had walked them for. Curdley House stood behind a high wall and a gate kept by a porter who would not admit her, whatever she said to him, being under strict instruction that His Grace was to receive no visitors while his health was so delicately balanced. She stood at that gate a long while regardless, the cold working its way up through the soles of her boots, until the porter grew tired of watching her stand there and went back inside, muttering something about women who did not know when they had been answered. It was only as she was turning to leave at last, her hands gone numb inside her gloves, and Amos heavy and half asleep against her shoulder, that she saw him, or thought she saw him, a shape at a second-floor window, behind glass gone gray with weather, still and upright in a way that told her, even at that distance, that he had been set in his chair and left facing whatever direction someone else had decided he ought to face. She raised her hand. She could not have said afterward whether he saw it or whether the shape at the window had moved at all, because it was gone again behind the glass, within the space of 4 seconds, too brief a thing to trust her own eyes over, and she walked the 11 miles back to Taunton with that half a glimpse, the only thing she had to carry against the whole cold weight of everything else. It was Cobb, dismissed from Racombe within the same week as Kezia, and lodging not far from her in Taunton, who found the thing that gave them their first real foothold since the verdict. He had gone looking in the days after, through whatever printed copies of the new act he could borrow or beg, sitting up past midnight in his own poor lodging, with a candle he could ill afford to burn so late, reading by its light with the slow determination of a man who had never been much of a scholar, and did not intend to let that stop him now, sounding out the harder words half aloud the way a schoolboy does, and he came to her lodging one evening with a page marked by a folded corner and read it aloud to her twice before he trusted himself to have understood it correctly. Any person confined under the Act, the clause read, near enough as Cobb rendered it, retained the right to write at any time to the commissioners in lunacy, and no letter so addressed might be opened, withheld, or in any way interfered with by the house that held him. To obstruct such a letter was itself an offense, under the very law that permitted the confinement in the first place. Cobb sat back when he had finished reading it and looked at her with the plain satisfaction of a man who had done something difficult and done it well. "I never thought I should live to be glad of an Act of Parliament," he said, "but I find I am glad of this one." Keziah sent word in the only way she could think of that might reach past a locked gate and a porter with his instructions. A note of no more than 7 words folded small and given to the woman who carried milk up to Curdley House each morning from a farm along the same lane, with a shilling to see it passed along rather than thrown away, and an address in London written beneath the 7 words, in case the 7 words alone meant nothing to whoever received them. She stood a long while at her own window that night, watching the milk cart pass in her mind's eye, though she could not, from a room in Taunton, actually see any part of the road it traveled, and told herself there was nothing more useful she could do that night than wait, and found waiting, as she generally did, a great deal harder than working. 3 days later a reply came, not to her but from him, smuggled out by some means she never learned and never asked after. A single sheet in his own hand, shorter than a letter ought to be, and steadier than she had any right to expect from a man 3 weeks into a confinement meant to prove his mind unsound. It said only that he had written to the commissioners as she had told him to, and that he trusted her, whatever came of it, more than he trusted anyone else living, and that he was sorry, more sorry than the sheet had room to say, that trusting her had cost her a place, a roof, and very nearly a boy's whole inheritance of a settled life. She read it standing in the doorway of her lodging, with Amos tugging at her skirts to be let in out of the cold, and read it twice more that night after he was asleep, by the last inch of a candle she could not properly afford to burn so late. It was in trying to answer that letter properly, and in trying to understand what use a letter to the commissioners could actually be made to serve, that Keziah asked Mr. Nunn to obtain for her a copy of the 2 certificates that had gone into the confinement order, the second set, the corrected ones Ruke had produced after her challenge at the door. Nunn got them for her within a week, no longer being under any obligation to Lady Brantham that might have made the asking awkward. And Keziah sat at the narrow table in her lodging and read them by candlelight the way she had once read deeds for pennies a sheet, and found, on the second certificate, a name and an address she did not recognize. Mr. H. Beddoe, surgeon and apothecary, of a street in Taunton she had passed 100 times without ever once having reason to stop. She went the following morning, telling herself only that she wished to see the face of the man who had signed away 3 weeks of another man's liberty, and found the address easily enough, a narrow shop front with a brass plate beside the door, newly polished, that read Rook and Beddoe, surgeons and apothecaries. She stood a moment on the pavement outside it, gathering the small remaining store of her own courage, before she pushed open the door and set a little bell ringing above her head. Partners. The word sat in her chest like a stone dropped down a well, because she had copied enough of the Act by then to know, with the same certainty she had known, the certificates bore the same hour, that 2 men who shared a practice, who shared its profits, and very likely its debts as well, could not lawfully certify the same patient. The Act was plain on it, A man might not be judged unsound of mind by his own partner's opinion dressed up as a second one. The bell over the door brought a man out from the back of the shop, 40-odd, coat a little worn at the cuffs, wiping his hands on a cloth that smelled of camphor. And he stopped dead in the doorway the moment he saw her face properly, gone the color of old paper. "You," he said before she had said a single word to him. "You are Mrs. Vellicott." "I am," she said, "though I do not think we have been introduced." "We have not," he said, and sat down rather suddenly on the stool behind his own counter, as though his legs had made the decision without consulting him first. "But I know your face, and I know your address better than I have any right to. I was called to it once, in the February of 1846, in the middle of a night I have not forgotten since, though I was asked never to say by whom I had been sent, and I have kept that silence faithfully for 2 years. Whatever else I have failed to keep faith with since." Kezia stood very still in the small crowded shop, surrounded by his jars and his scales and the dried bundles of herbs hanging from the beam above his head, and understood that she was looking at the physician who had saved her son, who had watched her husband die in the same room within the same week, and who had, some 2 years later, signed the paper that had taken the boy's other benefactor away from him in turn. It was a great deal to hold in one small shop at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and she held it as steadily as she could manage, because she had not come to weep at him, whatever else she had come to do. "Tell me about the second certificate," she said. He did not defend himself. He was not. She came to think afterward, watching him twist the cloth over and over in his hands. A cruel man, only a weak one, in debt to his own partner for the very lease of the shop he sat in, and frightened enough of Ruki's temper and Ruki's ledger both to sign whatever he was handed, rather than risk losing the roof over his own family's heads. He told her, in a voice gone thin with the shame of it, that he had never examined his grace separately at all, that Ruki had conducted the whole of the examination alone, and simply handed him the second certificate to sign after the fact was already settled, and that he had told himself, in the signing of it, that it changed nothing of substance, since his own opinion and Ruki's would very probably have agreed regardless, had he ever been properly asked for it. "That is not what the law requires of you, sir," Kezia said. "It does not ask whether you would have agreed. It asks whether you looked with your own eyes, separately, and set down what you yourself observed." "I know it now," he said. "I believe I knew it then too, and told myself otherwise because the telling was easier than the knowing." Before she left the shop, he went into the back room and returned with a folded paper, the deed of partnership between himself and Ruk, dated 18 months before. His own name and Ruki set out plainly side by side in a clerk's careful hand, and pressed it into her own hand without her having asked for it. "Take it," he said. "It is the only thing I have left that might undo some part of what I signed, and I find I would rather it did some good in your hands than sit locked in my own desk drawer, weighing on me the way it has weighed these 3 weeks past, every time I open that drawer for anything else." He walked her to the door himself, an unnecessary courtesy for a shopkeeper to extend a departing customer, and said, standing in the doorway with the bell still swinging faintly above them both, that he hoped she would tell his grace, when next she saw him, that the debt between them was not, in Beddoes' own accounting of it, fully settled by the giving of one deed alone, and that he intended to find some further way of settling it before he was done. The bottle she had kept back from the still room, hidden all this while wrapped in at the bottom of her trunk, went next to a young surgeon named Laveridge, 26, and newly sup in practice in Taunton, with more ambition than custom as yet, A thin, earnest man who listened to her whole account without once interrupting and then sat quiet a moment before agreeing to test it, for a fee smaller than her pride liked and larger than her purse strictly allowed. He used a method she did not pretend to understand, involving heated glass and a mirror of some dark residue he showed her afterward, with the careful pride of a man demonstrating his own competence to a client he suspected of doubting it, turning the glass this way and that in the light of his own window, so she might see the mark plainly for herself. He told her, in terms she understood a great deal better than the method itself, that the tonic contained antimony in a quantity no honest apothecary would ever have prescribed for general strength, in a manner calculated, he said, to produce exactly the confusion and unsteadiness she had described to him, and to clear the body again within days of the dosing stopping, leaving no trace behind for anyone to find who was not already looking for it. It is a cruel sort of poisoning, he said, folding his notes away, precisely because it is meant to look like nothing at all, and I have rarely been so glad to be asked to look for something that was never meant to be found. He asked her, before she left, whether she would permit him to keep his own notes on the matter, not for any fee beyond what she had already paid him, but because a young man building a practice in a county town did well to keep a record of the rarer cases that came his way, and she told him he might keep them, provided he understood that the case was not yet closed, and might yet want his testimony before it was. He agreed readily enough, and shook her hand at the door with a formality she suspected he did not often extend to patients half so poor as she currently was, and told her, as she stepped back out into the street, that he hoped very much to be proven right in whatever small part he had played toward setting the matter straight. It was Mr. Elias Pym, of a society in London, got up expressly to look into cases such as this one, who came down to Taunton within the fortnight, summoned by the letter Gervase had smuggled out under the protection of the Act. A neat, brisk man of some 39, who spoke of certificates and jury panels the way other men spoke of the weather from long and weary familiarity, and who had, Kezia gathered from his own conversation over the single cup of tea she could offer him, seen a dozen cases very like this one in the 5 years since the Act had passed, and had come, in that time, to hold very little faith in the goodwill of licensed houses left unwatched. He took the partnership deed and Beddoes' own written admission and Loveridge's report on the tonic and laid the whole of it before the commissioners in lunacy, with a thoroughness that left Keziah watching him work at her own narrow table, faintly ashamed of how small and improvised her own gathering of it had felt while she was doing it, piece by piece, with no clerk and no society, and no letters after her name to lend the asking any weight. "You have done the greater part of my own work for me already, Mrs. Vellacott," he told her, folding the papers away into a leather case worn soft with use. "Most families in your position bring me a suspicion and very little else. You have brought me a case. The commissioners acted within 3 weeks, ordering Gervase's release from Curdley House on the plain ground that the confinement itself had never been lawfully certified in the first place. But Pym was careful, sitting across from Keziah with his hat still in his hands, to make certain she understood exactly what the order did and did not do, because he had seen, he told her, a great many families mistake the one for the other and lose precious weeks in the mistaking. It freed him from the house. It did nothing whatever to touch the Inquisition's own verdict, which stood exactly where the jury had left it back in February, and would go on standing with Lady Brantham exactly where that earlier order had placed her, unless someone brought a fresh case to traverse it before an entirely new jury. The time allowed by law for such a challenge was short, he said, and shrinking further with every week. The matter sat unaddressed, and a confined man could not, in any lawfully instruct a solicitor to bring one on his own behalf. It was Mr. Nunn who filed the traverse in the first week of March, using his own money to do it, while Gervase was still on paper a confined man with no legal say in the spending of a shilling of his own fortune. He told Keziah, bringing her the news himself, that he had done it for Reuben's sake as much as for his grace's, and that it was, he thought, the nearest thing to a proper apology he was ever likely to manage for a man 2 years in his grave. By the last week of March, the 6 weeks of coin Keziah had begun with were very nearly gone, spent on rent and bread and Loveridge's fee and 100 smaller costs she had stopped troubling to add up. And it was in casting about the room for anything left that might still be sold that her eye fell on Reuben's old coat, hung these 2 years on a nail behind the door, and never once worn nor properly looked at since the day it came back to her with his few other effects. She had kept it, she understood now, for no reason she could have properly defended to anyone who asked, only that a woman does not easily part with the last whole garment a dead husband ever wore, even when the wearing of it herself was impossible, and the selling of it would have fetched a useful sum months before. The wooden button Amos still carried everywhere had come, she knew, from a tin of mending things kept in that same coat's deep pocket, and it seemed to her, taking it down at last, a small mercy that the boy was asleep and would not see his mother sell the last whole garment his father had ever owned. She meant only to fold it for the ragman, and it was in smoothing the lining flat that her fingers found a seam gone stiff and lumpy in a way good tailoring never left a seam, and she picked at it with a hairpin until it gave, and drew out a single sheet, folded small and gone soft with handling, in Reuben's own hand. It was the draft of a codicil, dated October of 1843. In the 5th Duke's failing hand, as Reuben had evidently been asked to render it fair, leaving a sum of £18,000 to his sister Drusilla, and beneath the draft, in different ink, and a hand grown smaller and tighter than his ordinary copying hand, as though written in some private haste, a memorandum in Reuben's own words. Her ladyship required me to sign as second witness to a document I did not see executed. It read. I refused. She told me I would lose my place for it. I set this down in case it should ever be wanted. Keziah sat on the floor of the narrow room with the coat still across her knees and the paper in her hand, and read it through twice, and then a third time, as though a third reading might yet find some kinder meaning hidden in the same handful of words, and did not find one. She understood all at once the whole shape of a thing that had taken her the better part of a year to gather in pieces, one loose fact at a time, the way she had once gathered figures from a well report, without knowing what sickness they would eventually spell out. Outside her window, the ordinary evening noise of the street went on, entirely unaware of what she had just found. A coster calling the last of his wares before dark, a child crying somewhere below, a dog barking twice and falling silent, and it struck Keziah, sitting very still in the middle of all that ordinary noise, that grief of this particular kind never announced itself to the world at large the way it announced itself inside a person's own chest, that a whole street could go on selling its vegetables and minding its children while a woman 2 floors up discovered the true cause of everything she had lost. Her husband had lost his place, and with it very nearly everything else that followed from the losing of it, the coin, the lodgings, in the end perhaps even the strength to fight off a fever that a stronger, better-fed man might have shaken, because he had refused to help a dying man's own sister steal £18,000 from an estate not yet settled. He had never told her. He had carried it alone for 2 years and more, through a dismissal he could not explain to her without shaming himself for a virtue that had cost them everything, through a lodging house and a fever and a night he must have known, somewhere near its end, that he was not going to survive, and he had gone into the ground still carrying it, leaving her only a button in a mending tin and a coat she had not thought to search until hunger forced her hand to it. And that same woman, 4 years later, had taken the whole of another man's fortune and liberty by very nearly the same trick, dressed this time in the language of a newer act rather than an old one, a codicil in place of a certificate, and had very nearly got away with it a second time on the strength of the same willingness in other people to look away rather than lose their own place in the world for the sake of somebody else's honesty. Kezia folded the paper along its old creases and sat a long while in the cold of the little room, not weeping, because she had long since spent whatever store of tears she had once kept for occasions such as this one, only turning the coat over in her lap, the way a person turns over a stone to see what has been living beneath it, and thinking that she had married a better man than she had ever quite understood while he was living, and that the knowing of it now, too late to tell him so, was its own particular kind of grief, sharper for having no one left to receive it. Gervase came to her lodging himself, on the day the commissioner's order was carried out, thinner than she had ever seen him, his color still poor from 3 weeks of confinement, and whatever the tonic had left behind in his blood, his coat hanging looser on him than it had any business hanging on a man not yet 35, but his eyes entirely his own again, sharp and steady, in a way that made her chest ache to see, after so many weeks of not seeing it at all. Cobb wheeled him up the narrow stair with a care that spoke of a man handling something he had feared. More than once these 3 weeks past, he might never get the chance to handle again. The first thing Gervase did, once Cobb had left them alone with the door held properly half open for propriety, was try to give her back her freedom. "You are not bound to any of this," he said, before she had properly poured the tea, Mrs. Pardoe had sent up with him in a basket, along with bread and a small jar of preserves that Kezia recognized with a tightness in her throat she had not expected. As her own still-room work from a house she no longer had any claim to. "I have cost you a place, a character, very nearly a roof over your son's head, and I will not go on costing you more merely because a promise was made in a warmer season than this one, before either of us properly understood what my aunt was prepared to do to see it broken. If you wish to consider yourself released from it, I would think no less of you. I would think, if anything, rather better of your sense than I already do." Kezia set the teapot down with rather more force than the cup strictly required. Amos, who had not seen him in 3 weeks, and had spent most of that time asking, with the persistence only a small child can sustain when the man with the wheels was coming back, chose that same moment to abandon his own game in the corner and fling both arms around whatever portion of Gervase's leg he could reach, entirely heedless of the gravity of the conversation taking place above his head. "You promised me plain speaking," she said, "not managing. Do you recall the difference you drew between them yourself? In that morning room, not 4 months past, sitting in that very chair." "I recall it," he said, and had the grace to look, for a moment, rather less sure of himself than she had ever seen him look before a jury. "Then, hear me plainly," she said. "What you are doing now, offering to release me for my own good, without once asking whether I wanted releasing, is managing, dressed up in the clothes of kindness. It is exactly the thing you gave me your word you would never do to me again, and I find I am not willing to let you break that word on our very first day of freedom, whatever the season, and whatever it costs either of us to keep it." He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face, Ease that had not eased, she thought, since long before the Inquisition had ever been spoken of between them. "I stand corrected," he said. "I will not offer it again." "See that you don't," she said, and poured the tea, and found, pouring it, that her own hand was not quite steady either, though for entirely different reasons than his had been. Amos, uninvited and entirely unbothered by 3 weeks of confinement or courtrooms, chose that moment to climb back onto the knee he had first claimed on a birthday 2 winters before. And Gervais's arm came around him, without his seeming to notice he had done it, the gesture already worn smooth by long habit. It was only after that, once the small storm of it had passed, that Mrs. Pardoe brought up a second paper, folded twice, and set it on the table between them without a word. It was a list, kept in Mrs. Pardoe's own hand over the whole of the 3 weeks past, of every soul who had come forward unasked to help meet the cost of a traverse none of them could properly afford. Mrs. Pardoe herself had given the whole of 22 years' savings, set aside against her own old age, and given up without, so she said, a single night's regret over the giving of it. Cobb had given his army pension, drawn early against the promise of more to come. The Yandles, who had buried 2 children the winter before, and owed more than they ever spoke of aloud, had sold their one remaining cow. 19 households along the lane toward Chard, every one of them a family that had received coal or bread that winter, without ever knowing where it truly came from, had each found some small sum to send, a shilling here, half a crown there, because word had traveled, as word always did in a country parish, of who it was that had been quietly keeping them through 3 hard winters running. Tabitha Escott had sent 3 shillings and 6pence, the whole of what she had, tied in a handkerchief, with her name pinned to it in a careful, laborious hand. Mr. Beddoe had sent the fare for a seat on the London coach, and a promise, in his own writing, to give evidence in person, whatever it cost his own name, to give it. Gervais read the list from top to bottom without once looking up, and when he reached the end of it, he set it down very carefully on the table, as though it might tear if handled roughly, and did not speak for a long while. Kezia watched his throat move once, twice, and understood that she was looking at a man discovering, all at once, and rather later than he might have wished, the true size of what 3 years of unwitnessed kindness had actually built around him, without his once meaning to build anything at all. When he did speak at last, his voice had lost most of its ordinary steadiness. "I did not do any of it to be repaid," he said. "I know that, Mrs. Pardoe said from the doorway, her own eyes not entirely dry either. "That is rather the point of it, Your Grace. Nobody on this list is repaying you. They are only doing for you what you did for them, without once thinking to ask whether it would come back to them, because it turns out that is a habit a whole parish can catch, given 3 winters and enough reason to catch it. They left Taunton on the 6th of April by post-chaise, the only conveyance that could accommodate the chair with any comfort over so long a distance, and reached London 2 days later, on the 8th, into a city that felt, from the moment their carriage crossed into it, entirely unlike the quiet county town they had left behind. Bills were posted on every wall calling the citizens to keep the peace on the 10th, when the Chartists meant to gather on Kennington Common some tens of thousands strong and carry a petition to Parliament, and the government, by every account reaching them along the road, had sworn in special constables by the tens of thousands to see that nothing worse than a petition crossed the river that day. Shopkeepers along their route were already boarding their windows 2 days early, and Keziah saw, more than once, small knots of men standing at street corners, reading the bills aloud to those among them who could not read, arguing in low, urgent voices about what Wednesday would bring. Amos came with them, because there was nowhere else in the whole of London for him to be left. No aunt, no cousin, no spare shilling for a nursemaid they did not know. And Kezia carried him through streets, thick with talk of barricades and bridges guarded by soldiers, on her way to a room where she would have to ask a room full of strangers to believe that a man who loved her was not, on that account alone, unfit to manage his own affairs. She had never in her life seen a city so large nor so loud, the noise of it pressing in on her from the every side, costermongers and carriage wheels and church bells, all competing for the same narrow air. And she held Amos' hand tighter than the crowd strictly required, less for his safety than for her own steadiness. It struck her, more than once on that short walk from their lodging to the courthouse, that the whole city seemed to be arguing the same question in a larger key: who might be trusted to speak for himself, and who must be spoken for by somebody else, whether by a committee or a constable or an act of parliament. And she did not know, walking through it with her son's hand in hers, and the crowd's low mutter all around them, which side of that argument she was more afraid of losing. Before the week was out, the Traverse opened on the 10th itself, before the same Commissioner Frayne who had presided at Taunton, now sent up to London for the fresh hearing, and a jury of 23 men drawn from the city rather than the county, none of them known to Lady Brantham, nor, so far as anyone could discover, to Gervase either, though Kezia noticed, taking her seat in a gallery a good deal grander than the one at the Castle Hotel, that the room itself felt somehow smaller for all its finer paneling, as though the whole of London, that particular week, had shrunk down to the size of whatever question was in front of it. The night before, in their lodging near the courts, with Amos finally asleep, and the sound of the city's uneasy watchfulness still drifting up through the window, Gervase had asked her, quietly, whether she was afraid, and Kezia had told him the truth, that she was, though not in the way he perhaps imagined. "I am not afraid of losing," she said. "I have already learned how to survive losing. This whole year past has taught me that lesson thoroughly enough. I am afraid of what it will cost you to win. If winning means standing up in front of strangers and being made to answer for loving me as though it were a symptom rather than a choice." He had taken her hand then, in the dark, and told her that whatever it cost him to say aloud, he had rather pay it honestly than buy his freedom with a lie about the one part of his life he was most certain he had got right. Mr. Nunn, appearing for him without fee, explained to Kezia on the courthouse steps, in the brisk practical tone he used for anything that mattered a great deal to him, his own hat still in his hands out of some old habit he had never quite shaken, that a new act passed only 5 years before, in 1843, had swept away the old rule that kept any person with an interest in a case from giving evidence in it, and that without that single change she herself would have been barred from the witness box entirely, her own hoped-for marriage making her, in the law's older and less generous eyes, too interested a party to be believed. "It is a strange thing," he added, almost to himself, that the very Parliament capable of passing an act to lock a sound man away on 2 hurried signatures should also, in the same decade, pass another that finally let an honest woman speak for herself in a court of law. I do not know that the 2 acts were ever meant to sit so close together in one person's story, but I find I am glad, this week of all weeks, that they do. The first day went well, better than well. Gervase, 7 weeks clear of any tonic and sharper for it than she had seen him even before the accident, answered every question put to him with a clarity that left the opposing counsel visibly recalculating his approach more than once, correcting 2 figures in the rent rolls that the man had got wrong, speaking of the water report, and the parish relief with the same plain competence he had once used to write down a still-room maid's opinion of a well. Asked by his own counsel to account for the wheeled chair itself, and for whatever bearing it might have on the jury's own deliberations, he answered, without any of the bitterness Keziah had once heard in his voice on the subject in the earliest days of their acquaintance. "My legs do not answer me," he said, "and have not these 3.5 years. My mind has never once, in all that time, failed to answer anyone who troubled to address a question to it properly, and I would ask this jury to judge the one and not the other, since the law itself asks nothing different of them." Keziah, watching from the gallery, with Amos asleep at last against her shoulder, thought she had never in her life been so proud of a man reciting figures aloud, and found the thought itself almost funny enough to laugh at, in a room where laughing was the last thing anyone could safely afford. Mr. Nunn had warned her beforehand that the second day would be harder than the first, that opposing counsel would have spent the night studying whatever ground the first day had lost him, and would come back with his sharpest weapon saved rather than spent early, and Keziah had thought, hearing the warning, that she understood it well enough already, having watched a jury turn once before in the space of a single afternoon. She had not. She came to think afterward understood it nearly as well as she believed she had. The Reinsch test was entered and explained to the jury in terms even Keziah, who had heard it once already from Loveridge's own mouth, found herself following more easily the second time. The dark mirrored residue described plainly as proof of a poison no honest apothecary would have prescribed for general strength. Beddoe gave evidence in person, exactly as he had promised. Arriving on the coach fare, the subscription had bought him, and looking, Keziah thought, like a man walking voluntarily toward his own professional ruin, because he had decided, at long last, that there were worse things to lose than a license. He did more damage to his own name in the giving of it than Rookie's counsel could ever have hoped to inflict on the other side, admitting under his own oath before a room full of strangers that he had signed a certificate for a man he had never separately examined, and that he had done it out of fear of his own partner rather than any medical judgment whatsoever. And last of all, the black leather ledger itself was entered into evidence, offered by Mr. Nunn as proof of a mind that kept careful, orderly, methodical account of everything that passed through its care, down to the last sack of coal, the last shilling of unpaid rent quietly forgiven. By the close of that first day, Keziah allowed herself, cautiously, the same dangerous hope she had once allowed herself in Taunton, and told herself this time it was better founded, better armed, better prepared for whatever the second day might bring. It was on the second day that opposing counsel rose with the ledger itself in his hand, and read from it aloud, and did not, she noted even through her rising alarm, distort a single word of what was written there. Coal, unbilled, to a named cottage. A physician called after midnight, paid to give no name. A debt at Chard, settled without the debtor's knowledge. He read the dates and read them again against each other, and pointed out to the jury, in a voice of careful reasonableness that was somehow worse than any shouting could have been, that every single entry, across 3 winters running, concerned the same household, the same woman. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have heard this ledger offered to you as proof of order. I would ask you to consider whether 3 years of secret, unacknowledged attention paid to one particular woman, catalogued with such care that not a shilling of it went unrecorded, is better described as benevolence, or as an obsession that has simply learned to keep excellent books." And then, before Mr. Nunn could rise to object, he turned to Gervase himself, still under oath, and asked him a single question, plainly, without ornament. "Is it your intention, your grace, To marry Mrs. Vellicott? The room went very quiet. Keziah, sitting where she could see his face, and he could see hers, understood in the same instant that he understood that he had given her his word in a small morning room on a cold afternoon, never again to manage her, never to spare her an unwelcome truth for the sake of comfort, hers or his own, and that a lie told now, however convenient, however likely to save the both of them a great deal of trouble in that room full of strangers, would be exactly such a management, dressed up as protection. She saw him weigh it in the half-second before he answered, and saw him choose, and understood, watching the choosing, that whatever else came of the day, she would not have wanted him to choose otherwise, whatever it cost either of them. "It is," he said. The word landed in the courtroom, the way the earlier verdict had once landed in Taunton. An opposing counsel did not so much as pause to let it settle before he turned back to the jury with the particular satisfaction of a man who has just been handed, free of charge, the very weapon he had been searching for all morning. "Gentlemen," he said, turning the ledger once more in his hand, "you have now heard it from his own lips. A duke of 34, in full possession of a considerable fortune, proposing marriage to a servant of his own household, a woman he has secretly showered with favor for 3 years running, entered in a private book like an account kept against some future debt. I ask you only to consider, as reasonable men, whether such an intention, arrived at under such circumstances, speaks more of a sound mind exercising its lawful liberty, or of a mind that has, in some particular and troubling respect, lost its ordinary judgment entirely." Keziah was called the following morning, the last witness either side meant to call, and she walked to the box, past a gallery gone entirely silent, past Drusilla's own face turned toward her with an expression of perfect, patient composure that Keziah had learned over 5 months to read as the Countess's truest sign. She took the oath in a voice she was rather proud afterward to remember as steady, and looked out at 23 strangers who held between them the whole of her future and the whole of Gervaise's in their unremarkable London hands. Opposing counsel came at her first with the question he had already planted so carefully the day before. "Mrs. Vellicott," he said, "you have heard his Grace declare, under oath, his intention to marry you. I ask you plainly, as I asked him, do you consider a duke's wish to marry a servant of his own household to be the act of a sound mind? Or do you, in your own heart, harbor some private doubt of it that decency alone prevents you from voicing here?" "Sir," Keziah said, "you are asking whether a man is unsound of mind for wishing to marry me. I cannot answer that question on his behalf, and I will not pretend to try. I can only say that if it is a species of madness for a man of high standing to wish to marry a woman of low standing, then a very great many marriages recorded in this kingdom's own parish registers were entered into by lunatics. And I do not think any of you gentlemen believe that to be true of your own mothers and fathers, whatever their stations were to begin with. A man who is truly incapable of managing his own affairs does not choose. He is chosen for by other people, who then tell the world it was his own wish all along. I have watched that happen to him once already this year, in a courtroom very like this one, and I would ask you not to let it happen to him a second time, merely because the manner of his choosing happens to embarrass a countess." "You speak very readily for a woman in service," opposing counsel said, his tone gone a shade sharper. "I speak plainly, sir," Keziah said, "because I was raised to it, and I have found no occasion yet in this whole affair where plain speaking served me worse than the alternative would have. My own mother raised me to believe that a person who must dress the truth in finer clothes before she dares offer it to a room generally does so because the truth, worn plain, would not survive the room's opinion of it, and I have found nothing in 5 months of hard experience to persuade me she was wrong." A ripple went through the gallery at that, quickly stilled by the commissioner's own raised hand, and opposing counsel, visibly recalculating for the second time in 2 days, turned instead to the ledger and read from it again the same entries he had read the day before: coal and physicians and unpaid debts, building toward the same conclusion he had built toward already: obsession dressed as benevolence. It was then that Mr. Nunn rose and asked the commissioner's leave to enter 2 further documents, which he had held back, he explained, precisely because he had known this line of attack was coming and had wanted to answer it whole rather than piecemeal. The first was the estate's own rent book, kept in the ordinary formal hand of the Racom clerk, showing reductions granted to 19 separate households across the 3 hardest winters of the famine years. Each reduction dated, each tenant named, each sum recorded exactly as any prudent landlord's steward would record it. The second was a bundle of correspondence between His Grace and the Poor Relief Committee at Chard, in his own hand, and the committees both, discussing grain prices and parish need with the same careful attention he had once given a well report. "Gentlemen," Mr. Nunn said, "I would ask you to set this rent book beside the ledger my learned friend has read to you twice now, and observe that every name in the one appears, sooner or later, in the other. The physician sent in secret, the coal delivered without a bill. These were not the isolated fixations of a diseased mind, circling a single object. They were the ordinary, unglamorous work of a landlord, managing an estate through the worst harvest this county has seen in a generation, done quietly, because His Grace did not wish his own tenants to feel the shame of charity, and recorded privately, because a man who keeps 2 sets of books, one for show and one for truth, is not thereby proven mad. He is proven, I would submit, considerably more honest than most." Keziah, still in the box, watched the jury's faces as Mr. Nunn spoke, and saw, for the first time in 2 days, something in several of them shift, not all at once, not dramatically, but the way a scale shifts when a single true weight is finally set upon it after a great deal of false ones. Called upon to name them, when the commissioner asked whether she could confirm the households in the rent book from her own knowledge, Keziah did so from memory, 19 names, in order: the Yandles, who had buried 2 children, old Gillard, her mother's cousin, the widow at the 4th cottage on Church Lane, each one recited without a single paper before her, because she had carried bread and coal to every one of those doors herself. In every hard winter the ledger described, and a woman does not forget the names of people she has fed with her own hands. She watched one of the jurymen, an older man with a weathered farmer's face, nod slowly to himself somewhere around the 12th name, as though a private account of his own had just been settled in his mind. It was after Keziah stepped down that Lady Brantham herself was called, at her own counsel's request, to answer to the ledger's other entries, the ones that concerned no tenant but only a maidservant and her son. And it was in the cross-examination that followed, conducted by Mr. Nunn with a quiet patience Keziah had not known he possessed, that the Coates paper was finally produced, not as an accusation offered fresh, but as a means of testing the truthfulness of everything the Countess had just sworn to. "You have told this jury, madam, that you acted throughout only from concern for your nephew's welfare," Mr. Nunn said. "I would ask you to explain, then, a document I hold in my hand, dated October of 1843, in the hand of a Mr. Reuben Vellacott, then a copying clerk in my own employ, and lately, I believe, this witness's own late husband." Lady Brantham's composure, so carefully held through 2 full days of testimony, cracked for the first time Keziah had ever seen it crack. A single visible falter before she recovered herself enough to claim she did not recall the document nor the clerk who had supposedly written it. "I employ a great many clerks in the course of managing my late husband's affairs," she said, her voice gone thinner than its usual even register. "I could not be expected to recall each one of them by name after 5 years." "You need not recall his name, madam," Mr. Nunn said. "I have brought him to you in his own hand. Perhaps the document itself will refresh what the years have not." He read the memorandum aloud, plainly, without embellishment, and confirmed under his own oath that the hand was known to him, that he had employed the writer for 4 years, and that he had dismissed the same man in December of 1843. Within 8 weeks of the date on the paper, on an instruction from above, that he had never, until this moment, understood the true reason for. "And who gave you that instruction, sir?" the commissioner asked, leaning forward for the first time in 2 days. Mr. Nunn turned, very deliberately, and looked at Lady Brantham before he answered. "The instruction came from this family, my lord," he said. "I did not think it my place at the time to ask which member of it had given it. I have come in the years since to have my own settled opinion on the matter." It was Crispin who broke the silence that followed, rising unbidden from his own seat among the witnesses waiting to be called, and asking the commissioner's leave to speak before he was properly summoned. "I cannot swear to what I do not know to be true," he said, and his voice shook badly enough that the whole room seemed to lean toward him to catch it. "I have sat through 2 days of this hearing believing I stood to gain something by my aunt's victory, some restoration of what I lost in February. I have learned since arriving in this city that I was named nothing at all in that earlier order, that I was made use of as a name on a petition and nothing more. And I find, now that I understand the full shape of what has been done, that I would rather lose whatever small allowance she still controls than stand here and swear to things I have never seen with my own eyes merely because I once hoped she meant to reward me for it. My father quarreled with her once over a matter very like this one, and never spoke of it again after, and I begin to think, gentlemen, that I understand now why his silence cost him so much more than mine is likely to cost me." The jury deliberated 20 minutes. Keziah counted them, this time, with a steadiness she had not managed in Taunton, because she found, sitting through the last of them, that she had already decided she could bear whatever came, having borne a great deal worse already that same year. When the foreman rose, the verdict came plain and unadorned. The Inquisition of February was set aside. A writ of supersedias was ordered to issue, restoring to Gervase Aylward the whole of his estate and the whole of his own person, undivided, unmanaged, his own again. Gervase did not rise to hear it, could not rise to hear it, and did not need to. He sat very still in his chair, with his eyes closed for a long moment after the words were spoken. And when he opened them again and looked across the room to where Keziah stood, she saw in his face the same expression she had once seen by candlelight in a library on a birthday nobody had come to, a man discovering all over again that he had not been abandoned after all. Mr. Nunn, standing beside him, put a hand briefly on his shoulder, the small, unremarkable gesture of one tired man toward another, after a long fight finally won, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left that morning that needed saying aloud. They stayed a full month in that London lodging while the writ of supersedias was drawn up and sealed, and the whole slow machinery of restoring an estate to its rightful master ground through its own necessary paces. And it was in that month, oddly, away from Racombe and its long gallery and its watching portraits, that Keziah felt for the first time that she and Gervase were simply two people learning to share a life together, rather than two people defending a right to attempt one. He taught her, in the evenings, to play at chess, a game his own father had taught him as a boy, and which he had not played since the accident, having lacked, he admitted, any opponent willing to sit still long enough for the purpose, and she proved, to his visible and increasing consternation, a quicker study at it than he had bargained for. Amos, for his part, adopted the whole business of London, with the same fearless curiosity he brought to everything, and had, by the end of the month, made the acquaintance of every pigeon in the small square below their windows, and named each one according to a system only he fully understood. The news of what followed reached Keziah mostly in pieces, by letter and by the columns of the Taunton Courier, which Mrs. Pardoe took to sending her, marked in pencil at the relevant paragraphs, and by Cobb's own account, delivered over tea in whatever kitchen the two of them happened to find themselves sharing that week. Lady Brantham was not prosecuted. Gervase declined to bring the charge, not from any forgiveness Keziah ever heard him claim to feel, but because a criminal trial would have dragged her own name through the London papers a second time, and he had decided, he told her plainly, one evening not long after their return to Racombe, that her privacy was worth more to him than his aunt's punishment, and that he had already watched one court proceeding turn her into a subject of strangers' idle talk, and did not intend to arrange a second. The codicil of 1843 was declared, by the same court that had heard the traverse, to have been void from the moment it was signed, for want of a second witness present at its execution, and Lady Brantham, who had spent 5 years believing £18,000 belonged to her by right, learned at last and for certain that it never had and never would. Gervase settled upon her a small annuity regardless, not out of tenderness, Keziah came to understand, but because the giving of it, quiet and without conditions, was itself the sharper rebuke, a mercy she had never once shown to anyone who could not repay her for it. And Keziah thought, reading the letter that told her of it, that she had never known a man capable of being so gentle and so unforgiving in the very same stroke of a pen. Lady Brantham removed to a smaller house in Shropshire before the year was out, and the invitation she continued, for a while, to send northward and southward went, by every account that reached Racombe, entirely unanswered. Crispin was granted a modest allowance on the single condition that he never again set foot in Somerset, a condition he accepted without argument, and he wrote, some months later, a letter of apology that Keziah received and never opened, not from any lingering anger, but because she had found by then that she no longer needed anything he might have written in it. Dr. Rook lost his license within the year, the commissioners having taken a particular interest, once alerted to it, in every other patient Curdley House had ever held, and the house itself was closed, its remaining occupants transferred, under the commissioner's own supervision, to establishments better able to answer for their treatment. Mr. Beddoe left Taunton for Bristol, his own practice ruined by his testimony, and Gervase, without ever explaining himself to anyone who asked, quietly settled the last of the man's debts before he left, the same way he had once settled a corn merchant's account without ever giving his own name for the doing of it. Keziah asked him once, gently, why he troubled himself over a man who had after all signed the very paper that had cost him 3 weeks of his liberty, and Gervase told her only that a man who had once saved her son's life at 2 in the morning, and who had later found the courage to undo his own worst mistake in open court, whatever it cost him, had more than balanced his own account. In Gervase's private reckoning, however, the law itself might have chosen to keep the books. In August, an Act for the better care of the public health was passed in Parliament, and buried within its supporting papers, cited without any fanfare at all, was a survey of a parish well in Somerset. Its infant deaths tallied against the seasons, its water ran foul, gathered over 3 years by a man whom half the county had, for one dreadful winter, believed unfit to hold a pen. They were married in October, a full year to the week, since a candle stub had burned on the corner of a desk in an empty library. It was not by any measure a duke's wedding was generally expected to be, a large affair. 4 families in the county whose acquaintance Lady Brantham had cultivated carefully over years sent their regrets and never called again after. And Gervase said, when Keziah asked him whether it troubled him, that he had already lost a great deal more than 4 families' good opinion that year, and found he had grown rather practiced at surviving the loss of things he had once thought he could not do without. She did not press him further on it, understanding well enough by then that a man's practiced calm and a man's true feeling were not always the same coin, but she noticed, all the same, that he wrote no letters that autumn to any of the 4 families in question, though he had once in his father's time dined with 2 of them regularly. Amos was settled by the marriage articles Mr. Nunn drew, with provision enough to see him raised and educated and started fair in whatever life he chose, though never, Gervase made plain to her, without her needing to ask it of him, as heir to a title that could not pass to him by any law either of them had the power to alter. She had not expected otherwise, and told him so, and he said only that he was glad she had not, because he had not wanted to be the one to tell her. The title itself, he added, after a moment, would pass in time to a distant cousin neither of them had ever met, a man farming somewhere in the north of the county with no particular ambition toward a dukedom he had never expected to inherit. And Gervase said he found he did not much mind the prospect having come, over the course of that whole difficult year, to value the parts of his life that could not be inherited or taken from him by any court in the kingdom rather more highly than the parts that could. He could not walk to meet her at the chapel door, and the wedding did not pretend otherwise. He was brought in his chair, Cobb on one side and Mr. Nunn on the other, and for the giving of his own vow he asked to be raised between them, and stood unsteady but upright for the better part of a minute, long enough to say the words looking down into her face, rather than up into it, before he was settled again into the chair for the rest of the service. Mrs. Pardoe wept without any shame at all in the second pew, and Tabitha Escott, grown a little taller that year, stood beside her, holding a posy. She had picked herself from whatever the October garden still had to offer, chrysanthemums mostly, gone a little ragged at the edges but chosen, Keziah could tell, with more care than their raggedness let on. Old Gillard came down from his cottage for the first time in above a year, leaning on a nephew's arm, and blessed her again by her mother's name as she passed him on her way out of the chapel. And Keziah thought, hearing it, that some debts a person never fully stops repaying, and was glad on the whole not to be finished with that particular one. They took no wedding journey, Gervase's health and the season both arguing against it, and settled instead into the ordinary business of a household learning to run itself around a marriage nobody in the county had quite expected to see completed. Mrs. Pardoe stayed on as housekeeper, refusing every suggestion that her 22 years of savings, given so freely to the Traverse, ought now to buy her a quieter retirement, and told Keziah plainly that she had kept this house through worse winters than marriage was likely to bring it, and did not intend to abandon her post now that the winters were finally turning kinder. Cobb stayed on as well, his old army pension never repaid to him in any formal sense, though Gervase saw to it, quietly and without ever calling it repayment, that the man wanted for nothing for the rest of whatever years he had left in him. A year on from the candle, in the same small morning room that faced east, and had always caught the last of the day's warmth better than any grander room in that whole enormous house, the fire burned much as it had burned that first night. And old Ringwood slept before the hearth, fat now, and entirely unbothered by anything the world might still have wanted from him, on a cushion that had become, by some process nobody had ever formally agreed to, permanently his own. Amos, 3.5 now, and steadier on his feet than he had any right to be for a boy who had spent half his short life being carried from one lodging to another, knelt on the rug building a tower of wooden blocks with the fierce concentration only a small child brings to a task of no consequence whatsoever. Gervais sat by the window, not watching the drive this time, but watching his wife cross the room toward him with 2 cups of tea, balanced in her 2 hands, with the same plain competence she brought to everything she had ever done in that house, from the folding of linen to the reading of an Act of Parliament. She set the cups down. She took his bare hand in hers, the glove already off, the way it so often was between them now, and their fingers laced together and did not come apart. He turned her hand over once, the way he had once turned over a wooden button, and pressed his mouth briefly to the palm of it, a small, unhurried gesture that had become, over the months of their marriage, so familiar to her that she scarcely noticed it happening anymore, and loved it, Shy thought, all the more for that very familiarity, the way a person comes to love the sound of a clock they have lived beside, so long they no longer properly hear it strike. They did not come apart when Amos knocked his tower flat and laughed outright at the wreckage of it. They did not come apart when the old dog stirred, sighed once, and settled again into a deeper sleep. They did not come apart for a long while after the light outside had gone soft and gold, and then, gradually, to the blue-gray dusk of an October evening, closing in over a house that had once, on an evening very like this one, stood entirely empty of anyone who cared to celebrate anything at all. It is a small thing, most nights, to be truly seen. It is very often the only thing that proves what a person is, underneath everything else, when they believe no one of any consequence is watching them at all. If this story stayed with you the way a quiet kindness sometimes does, long after the louder things have been forgotten, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Tell us in the comments which one you think truly saved the Duke in the end, the old dog at the kennel fence, or the paper sewn into the lining of a dead man's coat. Come back soon. There is always another quiet person in these stories doing something good and costly while they believe no one is watching, and somewhere, always, another household, slowly learning how to see them.